There is something about the world of Pokémon that never fully lets you go. Maybe it started when you were sitting cross-legged on a carpet somewhere, a Game Boy balanced in both hands, the glow of the screen the only light cutting through the dark of a room where everyone else had already fallen asleep. Maybe you were under a blanket, the tiny speaker muffled against the sheets to keep from waking your parents. Maybe it was the feeling of those small, tinny sounds drifting up from the speaker and filling your whole skull. The jingle of a new route, the cry of a Pokémon you hadn't seen before, the particular musical phrase that played when you finally cracked open a gym badge and the game congratulated you in its small, earnest way. Or maybe it was something quieter than any of that. The way the world inside the cartridge felt bigger than it had any right to be. The sense that every patch of tall grass was holding something you hadn't found yet. Pokémon was, from the very beginning, a world that felt bigger on the inside than it looked from the outside. And the older you get, the more you start noticing the seams. The places where the story goes quiet. The corners where the lore doubles back on itself and refuses to resolve cleanly. The questions that the games and the anime raise and then leave hanging in the air. Like smoke from a candle that nobody lit, but nobody is quite willing to blow out. This is a video for those questions. We're going to go slowly tonight. There's nowhere to be, and the kind of mysteries we're discussing don't benefit from being rushed. We'll be covering some of the deepest, strangest, and most enduringly unanswered puzzles in the entire Pokémon franchise. Not just the lore gaps that fans have theorized around, though there are plenty of those. We're going to dig into the stories that have genuinely never been resolved. The things that Game Freak has left deliberately ambiguous. The legends that assembled themselves from scratch on early internet forums and in school playgrounds, and in the margins of strategy guides, and that have somehow survived decades of debunking to remain culturally alive. Some of what we'll discuss tonight is real mystery in the sense of genuine, unresolved narrative questions from the official games and anime. Some of it is the history of how fan communities built their own mythology around those gaps. All of it is the kind of thing that feels right to think about in the late hours, when the day has gotten soft and the noise has finally died down. So settle in, get comfortable. Let the world get a little quieter around you, and let's go somewhere familiar that still manages to be strange. After the first section, drop us a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. We always love seeing where our viewers are when they settle in for one of these long dives. And if you haven't subscribed yet, tap that button now so you never miss another video. We do these regularly, and every single one is built for exactly this kind of late-night listening. Section 1. The Lavender Town Enigma, a town that became a legend. There is a town in the Kanto region of the original Pokémon games with no gym, no department store, and no Pokédex professor. It sits quietly between Route 8 and Route 12, a small cluster of buildings rendered in the purple-gray palette the games reserve for places with weight. There is a Pokémon Center because there's always a Pokémon Center. There is a small building where a man named Mr. Fuji looks after abandoned and orphaned Pokémon. And there is, dominating the center of the map, a tower 7 stories tall that serves as a burial ground for Pokémon that have died. Trainers come there to lay their companions to rest. The structure is called the Pokémon Tower. The town around it is called Lavender Town. The music that plays in Lavender Town is short. It loops every 40 seconds or so, built from a small collection of notes, arranged in a progression that resists resolution. The melody circles. It returns to certain phrases and then departs from them. In ways that feel slightly wrong, slightly off-center, the way a picture hanging 2 degrees crooked bothers you more than a picture hanging completely sideways. It has the quality of something that is almost settling before it changes direction again. For a game primarily populated with cheerful adventure themes and triumphant gym music, the Lavender Town track occupies a different emotional register entirely. It sounds like it belongs in a graveyard, which is fitting because it was written for one. Junichi Masuda, the composer, has said relatively little about the piece specifically, though he has discussed his general approach to the Pokémon soundtracks at various points over the years. The technical constraints were significant. The original Game Boy's sound chip produced audio through a limited number of channels with limited waveform variety, which meant every piece of music was an exercise in doing the most with very little. The Lavender Town theme works, in part, precisely because of those constraints. The thinness of the sound, the high-pitched quality of the tones, the lack of warmth that would usually be provided by lower frequencies. All of it contributes to an atmosphere of cold, hollow grief that richer audio hardware might not have produced with such efficiency. For the players who encountered Lavender Town for the first time as children in 1996, in Japan, or in 1998 and 1999 when the games reached international markets, the experience of arriving in that town was one that many have described with a consistent vocabulary over the decades since. Uncomfortable, wrong, unsettling in a way that was hard to name at the time. Some players turned the volume down, some hurried through as quickly as they could. Others lingered, drawn by the same instinct that makes people slow down at things they're not supposed to look at too closely. This collective, generational unease is the bedrock on which one of the most famous internet legends in history was eventually built. But the foundation existed long before anyone built anything on it. The real Lavender Town, the canonical one, was already doing something remarkable for a game of its era and its target audience. Lavender Town exists in Pokémon Red and Blue as a confrontation with death in a franchise that otherwise carefully avoids the subject. Pokémon faint in battle. They are healed at Pokémon centers. The word death does not appear in the game's dialogue in any direct form. The world of Pokémon, as presented through its gameplay mechanics, is one where conflict has no permanent consequences and healing is always available around the next corner. But Lavender Town punctures that. In Lavender Town, Pokémon have died. Trainers have lost companions they loved. The spirits of the deceased remain, restless and unable to fully depart. And the spirit that anchors the town's story arc, the ghost on the floors, above where your vision is blocked and you cannot pass, turns out to be the ghost of a Marowak, a mother Pokémon who was killed by members of Team Rocket while trying to protect her baby Cabone from being captured. She died protecting her child. Her ghost cannot leave until someone acknowledges what was done to her. Her Cabone cannot leave the tower, trapped by its own grief. And the player's journey through the Pokémon Tower is, beneath its surface-level function as a dungeon that must be traversed, a quiet meditation on loss, on the way grief binds the dead and the living to the same spot, on the necessity of acknowledgement before there can be release. This is a remarkable thing to find in a game marketed to 7-year-olds in 1996, and the music suited it, and the players, young and old alike, felt something when they were there, even if they couldn't have named what it was. That felt experience, accumulated across millions of players over years, is what became the raw material for a legend. In February of 2010, a piece of writing was posted to the website Pastebin by an anonymous user. It was written in the register of a documentary or news report, the kind of thing that sounds like it might have been copied from a real source, and it claimed to describe events that had taken place in Japan in the spring of 1996, in the weeks immediately following the release of Pokémon Red and Green. According to this account, children who played the games and reached Lavender Town began experiencing a disturbing range of symptoms. Headaches, nosebleeds, persistent insomnia, irrational behavior, and, in the most extreme claimed instances, a wave of suicides among children between the ages of 7 and 15. The cause, the story claimed, was the music. Not the music as most players experienced it, but the original version. A version specific to those first Japanese cartridges, which contained audio frequencies in a range that only children and adolescents could hear clearly because their developing ears were more sensitive to high-pitched tones. These frequencies, the story alleged, caused direct neurological harm when heard through the Game Boy's small speaker at close range. And in the most vulnerable individuals, the psychological damage was severe enough to trigger self-destructive behavior. The games were supposedly recalled after roughly 200 children died. The music was altered. And the Western releases of Red and Blue, which came 2 years later, contained only the sanitized version, the frequencies removed by a company that understood exactly what had happened and was desperate for no one outside Japan to ever find out. This is, to be absolutely clear, entirely fabricated. There is no historical record of mass child suicides in Japan in the spring of 1996 that can be traced to any cause related to Pokémon. No contemporaneous news reporting, no medical documentation, no government records, no police logs. The kind of public health crisis described would have been genuinely impossible to conceal in a country with functional journalism and transparent medical systems. And the claims about the audio frequencies themselves fail basic psychoacoustics. While very loud or specifically modulated sounds can cause physical discomfort, the Lavender Town theme playing through the Game Boy's tiny mono speaker was nowhere near capable of causing the neurological effects described. The story is a very well-constructed lie, and it spread. By March of 2010, it had moved from Paspin to 4chan's paranormal board, from there to Tumblr and Reddit, and the early Pokémon fan forums, and with each migration it picked up new details. A spectrogram analysis supposedly revealed hidden images in the waveform of the original audio, a ghost figure, and, more disturbingly, symbols that appeared to spell out the phrase "Get Out" in Unown, the alphabet-themed Pokémon from Gold and Silver. The disturbing detail was that Unown didn't exist in the Pokémon universe until 1999, 3 years after the track was originally composed. How could Unown symbols appear in a spectrogram of a 1996 audio file? The answer was that they couldn't and didn't, because the spectrogram images were edited and shared alongside the story to make the claim look more convincing. But the question, the apparent impossibility of the Unown appearance, made the story feel more mysterious, more in need of explanation, more like there was something real underneath it that needed to be uncovered. The legend continued to grow through a collaborative process that is itself one of the most interesting things about it. Fake psychiatric reports appeared, supposedly documenting the symptoms of affected children. Alleged internal Nintendo memos were fabricated and shared as supposed leaked documents. Accounts from supposed insiders, people who claimed to have worked at Game Freak or to have family connections to the Japanese medical establishment, surfaced in forum threads and were treated as testimonials. Each new piece of fabricated evidence attracted more engagement and more elaboration. The story was, in the most literal sense, a piece of collaborative fiction that built itself in real time across dozens of contributors who often had no awareness that they were participating in a collective creative project. Researchers who have studied the Lavender Town Syndrome phenomenon from an academic perspective have identified several reasons why the legend found such fertile ground. One is the Porygon precedent. In December of 1997, an episode of the Pokémon anime called Den-o Senshi Porygon aired to 4.6 million Japanese households and caused over 700 children to be hospitalized with seizure symptoms due to a sequence of rapidly flashing red and blue lights. This was a real incident, well documented and widely reported. It established, in the cultural memory of anyone who followed Pokémon, that the franchise had already been connected to a genuine case of media causing neurological harm to children. The Lavender Town story drew on that precedent. If it had happened once, it could happen again. The credibility of the Porygon incident lent a thin plausibility to the completely fabricated Lavender Town syndrome. Another reason the legend spread so effectively is what one academic paper described as the Japanese language barrier. The story claimed events that supposedly took place in Japan, reported in Japanese media, documented in Japanese medical records. For the vast majority of Western Pokémon fans, those sources were inaccessible. You could not simply Google them. You could not pick up the newspaper and check. The foreign setting created a kind of epistemic distance that made the story harder to debunk without active effort, and harder to dismiss without feeling like you might be wrong to do so. The composer of the Lavender Town music, Junichi Masuda, did in fact revise the track between the original Japanese release and later versions of the game. This is verifiable and true. The revised track is noticeably different, with some of the higher tones adjusted and the overall feel slightly altered. This real change became, in the context of the legend, powerful circumstantial evidence. Why would Nintendo change the music if nothing had happened? The question ignores the obvious and mundane explanation, that audio revision is routine in game development and localization, and that the Lavender Town theme may simply have been tweaked because someone thought it could be improved. But the question, once asked, was very hard to answer in a way that satisfied the people who wanted the legend to be true. The story also drew on something that was always already present in the community: a genuine, pre-existing unease about Lavender Town that predated the legend by years. Players had been describing the discomfort of that town's music since 1996. By the time the first creepypasta appeared in 2010, there was already a large pool of first-hand testimony from players who remembered the music as unusually disturbing. The legend did not create the feeling. It provided a narrative container for a feeling that was already there. And that is perhaps the key to understanding why the story persisted and evolved even as it was repeatedly and thoroughly debunked. The debunking addressed the fabricated claims. It did not address the original feeling, which was real and remained real regardless of what the legend said about its cause. Even now, with the story of Lavender Town Syndrome thoroughly documented as the creation of anonymous internet users in 2010, the music retains its reputation. New generations of Pokémon fans encountering it for the first time describe the same unease that players felt in 1996. The legend has become entangled with the original experience in ways that cannot be fully separated. If you know the story of Lavender Town Syndrome before you first enter Lavender Town, your experience of the music is colored by that story. And if you encounter the music first and the story second, the story feels like a retroactive explanation for something you had already felt. The legend self-reinforces from both directions. What the story of Lavender Town Syndrome ultimately reveals is something important about how people relate to the things they loved as children. The franchise was becoming older, more familiar, more commercial. The magic of first encountering it at exactly the right age was gone for the generation that had grown up with it. The creepypasta offered something that nostalgia alone could not. It made the games feel dangerous again. It suggested that the familiar world contained hidden depths, that the cheerful adventure game had a dark underside that the official version was concealing. It re-enchanted the franchise by threatening it, and that, for many people, was more valuable than any amount of factual correction. The Lavender Town music still plays the way it always played. It still circles without resolution. And if you listen to it alone in a dark room, you will probably still feel something. The feeling was never caused by the legend. The legend was built to explain the feeling, and the feeling, it turns out, was built into the game itself by a composer named Junichi Masuda, who was trying to write music for a graveyard and succeeded. Section 2. Missing No. The Ghost in the Machine. There is a Pokémon that does not belong in the world. It has no Pokédex entry in the conventional sense. It has no trainer's name attached to its history. It has no place in any official evolutionary line. No type that exists in the game's normal type chart, no origin story that the franchise has ever acknowledged. It exists in a space between valid data and empty code, a shape that the game's engine produces when it tries to render something that was never supposed to be there. You can find it if you know the right steps. You can catch it. You can put it in your party and carry it alongside Charizard and Blastoise and the other creatures of the official world. And when you do, the game behaves strangely around it, as if it knows it is hosting something it was not designed to host. Its name, as the game displays it, is Missing No, an abbreviation that Game Freak never intended players to see, derived from the phrase missing number, a technical label for empty data slots in the Pokémon roster. By any reasonable measure, Missing Number is not a Pokémon. It is the visible form of an error in memory management. It is what the game looks like when it is trying to do something it was never asked to do. And yet it is, without question, one of the most culturally significant creatures in the franchise's history. To understand what Missing Number actually is in a technical sense, you need to understand a small piece of how the original Pokémon games were built. When Game Freak and Nintendo were developing Red and Blue for the original Game Boy, they were working with hardware that operated in 8 bits, meaning that data was stored and processed in units that could hold any value from 0 to 255. The game needed a way to identify each of the 151 Pokémon in the original roster. Each Pokémon was assigned a number, and those numbers were stored in 8-bit variables. But 8-bit variables can hold 256 different values, not 151, and in computer architecture you can't simply tell the hardware to only use part of the available range. The game effectively reserved 256 slots for Pokémon identifiers. 151 of those slots were filled with real Pokémon. The other 105 were empty. Under normal gameplay, the encounter system that determined which Pokémon appeared in wild battles only ever referenced the 151 valid Pokémon numbers. Players should never have encountered one of the empty slots. The game simply wasn't supposed to look at those spaces. But there is a sequence of actions that players discovered eventually that causes the game to look at exactly those spaces. And the sequence is an accident of elegant coincidence. In Viridian City, near the beginning of the game, there is an old man who shows you how to catch Pokémon. When you trigger his tutorial, the game temporarily overwrites your player name in the game's memory, replacing it with the phrase "old man" and storing your actual name in a different memory location called the Battle Encounter Buffer, the same buffer the game reads from when determining which Pokémon should appear in a wild battle. This buffer swap is a small piece of practical programming, a way for the game to manage data without permanently overwriting anything important. When the tutorial ends, your name is restored, and the buffer is supposed to be updated with the encounter data for whatever area you're in. But here is where something remarkable happens. If you fly directly from Viridian City to Cinnabar Island and surf along the eastern coast of the island, you find yourself in a strange situation. Cinnabar Island's eastern shore is a border zone, a strip of water that exists at the edge of the game's map. The game has no specific encounter data assigned to this strip. Instead of reading from a location-specific encounter table, the encounter system falls back on whatever happens to be in the battle encounter buffer at that moment. And what's in the battle encounter buffer, if you have come directly from the Viridian City tutorial, is your player name. The game reads the characters of your player name as if they were Pokémon index numbers. Each character in the name corresponds to a value, and that value is treated as the identifier for the Pokémon that should appear in this battle. If those values happen to correspond to empty slots in the Pokémon roster, the game tries to load a Pokémon with no data attached to its slot. What the engine produces in that situation, when it tries to render a sprite for a creature that doesn't exist, is missing number. The backward L shape of scrambled pixels is what corrupted or empty data looks like when the game's rendering system tries to turn it into an image. Depending on which characters are in your name and in which positions, the specific form of missing number you encounter varies. The most common form, the scrambled pixel blocks, appears when certain specific characters are in the 3rd, 5th, or 7th positions of your name. Other name configurations produce different results. Some produce a missing number that looks like a fossil sprite from the Pewter City Museum. Others produce a version that looks like the ghost sprites from Pokémon Tower. These alternate forms exist because the empty slots that those name configurations point to happen to contain references to those graphics stored nearby in the game's memory. The fossil and ghost sprites were stored in locations the game can accidentally reference, and so they become the face of the unknown. There are additional effects to encountering missing gnome. That made it even more compelling to the players who discovered it. The quantity of the 6th item in the player's bag tends to increase dramatically after a missing numbered encounter, often climbing into triple digits. This happens because of a spillover in the game's memory during the encounter sequence, where data that was supposed to represent one thing bleeds into the space where item quantity is stored and increments it. For players carrying rare candies or master balls in their 6th slot, this was an extraordinarily practical outcome of what could otherwise be dismissed as a curiosity. Missing number could effectively duplicate your rarest items. Finding it stopped being an accident and became, for many players, a deliberate strategy. Nintendo's official response was a warning. In May of 1999, Nintendo Power published a brief explanation of missing gnome that described it as a programming quirk and cautioned players that encountering it could potentially corrupt save files or produce lasting graphical glitches. The warning advised players to release the creature if captured and to restart their game if problems persisted. This official statement had precisely the opposite of its intended effect. Information on how to find missing numbers spread more rapidly, not less. Tips were reportedly exchanged for money. Player guides included the encounter method. The creature that Nintendo wanted forgotten became a cultural phenomenon. Part of what made missing numbers so compelling to the players who found it was its physical existence within the game's world. It wasn't invisible. It had a sprite, however scrambled, It had a level. It knew moves, typically Sky Attack and Water Gun, with the latter appearing twice in its moveset because of how empty move slots are handled by the game's data structure. It had the highest base attack stat of any creature in the original games, paired with the lowest base defense stat, making it simultaneously the most powerful and most fragile Pokémon in the roster. You could catch it, you could nickname it, you could store it in your PC box alongside your trained team. Every affordance of a real Pokémon was present in a thing that wasn't supposed to exist. And so the theorizing began. Not the technical theorizing, which most players of the late 1990s weren't equipped to do, but the narrative theorizing. What did missing number mean within the story world of Pokémon? Why was it there? What had it once been? The most persistent narrative theory connects missing number to the Pokémon mansion on Cinnabar Island, the same island where it most commonly appears. The mansion is one of the most atmospheric locations in the original games, a ruined building full of journals written by an anonymous scientist who studied Mew and eventually created Mewtwo through years of genetic experimentation. The journals describe the process going wrong, describe Mewtwo escaping, describe the abandonment of the facility. Wild Pokémon roam the abandoned halls. The sense of something having gone terribly wrong is pervasive throughout the building. Missing number shows up at the coast of that island. It exists in the empty slots that surround the 151 valid Pokémon entries. Some fans propose that missing number was not empty data at all, but the data remnant of a Pokémon that had been deleted from the game before it shipped. The theory of the deleted Pokémon argues that at some point in development, Game Freak had more than 151 creatures in the roster, that some were cut late enough that their basic data structure was already in place, and that those data structures, cleared of their content but not fully removed, became the empty slots that missing number inhabits. The Pokémon Mansion in this reading is the story of experiments that produced things which were then destroyed, and the ghosts of those destroyed things are the missing number wandering the coast. This theory gained significant additional weight when the Space World 1997 demo of Pokémon Gold and Silver leaked in 2018 and revealed roughly 100 Pokémon designs that had never made it into the final game. If the development of Gold and Silver produced that many creatures that were ultimately cut, the reasoning went, then the development of the original games almost certainly produced creatures that were cut as well. And the evidence might still be there in the empty slots, in the cries that researchers have found attached to some of those slots, in the scrambled pixel forms that the game produces when it tries to render the void. Missing number has now been referenced in other video games, in academic papers on error and glitch aesthetics, in sociological studies of how players develop relationships with unintended game content, and in the broader cultural conversation about what it means when a technical accident becomes beloved. In 2022, what appeared to be a small background Easter egg referencing Missing No was spotted in a trailer for Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, suggesting that after almost 30 years of official silence, Game Freak has begun to acknowledge the creature's existence with at least a gentle nod. But the real question, the one that has never been answered, and perhaps never will be, is what missing number was before it was nothing. The empty slots it inhabits were, in the most neutral technical reading, simply gaps in a roster that didn't need 256 entries. But they contain data. Some of them contain audio cries, some contain partial stat information. The presence of that data in supposedly empty slots is what suggests, without confirming, that something was once there. That the void has a shape because something used to fill it. That missing number is not the form of absence. It is the form of something absent, the outline of a ghost, where the ghost used to stand. Nobody at Game Freak is going to tell you what that something was. And maybe that is, in some sense, the right outcome. The mystery of Missing Nomon has now been alive for almost as long as the franchise itself. The ambiguity has become part of its identity. It lives in the empty space, and the empty space is, by now, its home. Section 3. Ditto and the Shadow of Mew, the Failed Clone Theory. Of all the mysteries in the original 151 Pokémon, perhaps none is so quietly, persistently strange as the one that exists between two seemingly unrelated creatures, one mythical and one mundane, one rare beyond measure and one found in patches of ordinary grass. Mew is, in the game's own mythology, the ancestor of all Pokémon. Its Pokédex entry states that it contains the DNA of every Pokémon in the world, a genetic completeness that no other species possesses. It can use any move, it can learn any technical machine. Its body encodes the entire evolutionary history of the Pokémon world within it, a single creature that is, in a sense, all creatures simultaneously. Mew is so rare that the scientific establishment of the Pokémon world was not certain it still existed until a small population was discovered in the jungles of Guyana. And even then, capturing a Mew required either a special event distribution from Nintendo or one of the most elaborate and specific glitches in gaming history. Ditto is not any of these things. Ditto is found in multiple locations throughout the Kanto region, appearing with reasonable frequency in patches of tall grass and in certain cave areas. It is small, apparently featureless, looking like a small purple blob with a face. Its Pokédex entry describes it simply as a Pokémon capable of transforming into anything. There is no mythology attached to it, no ancient legends, no scientists dedicating their careers to understanding it. It is described in every entry focused almost exclusively on its one distinguishing characteristic and nothing else. And yet the evidence that these two creatures are connected at a level that goes well below the surface is, depending on how you read it, either compelling enough to be uncomfortable or so neatly assembled that it feels deliberate. The first and most obvious connection is the move Transform. Of the original 151 Pokémon, only Mew and Ditto can use it. Not Zoroark, not Mimikyu, not Smeargle, not any of the other illusion-type or copy-type Pokémon introduced in later generations. Those creatures can approximate or resemble other Pokémon in limited ways, but Transform specifically causes the using Pokémon to become the target Pokémon, adopting all of its physical and statistical characteristics completely. The mechanics of Transform suggest a capacity to completely overwrite one's own identity and assume another. As a move, it requires access to the complete genetic information of every other creature, because you cannot become something you don't already contain the blueprint for. The logic of the move, if you follow it through, implies that Mew and Ditto share something fundamental at the level of their basic biology. The second connection is statistical. Both Ditto and Mew have base stats of 48 in every category, a perfectly balanced distribution that no other Pokémon possesses. Both weigh exactly 8.8 pounds. Both are genderless. These shared qualities are unusual enough individually. Together, they point toward a relationship that has no obvious natural explanation. The third connection is chromatic. Normal Mew is pink. Normal Ditto is a slightly more lavender-purple shade of pink, within the same range. Their shiny forms are, in both cases, a pale shade of blue. Of the original 151 Pokémon, the only other creatures whose shiny forms match so precisely are those that belong to the same evolutionary family or are explicitly designed as counterparts to one another. Mew and Ditto are neither. The fourth connection is geographic. In Pokémon Yellow, which came slightly after the original Red and Blue and made several adjustments to the available wild encounters, Ditto can be found in the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island and in the Cerulean Cave. The Pokémon Mansion is the abandoned research facility where the scientists' journals describe the creation of Mewtwo through the cloning and modification of Mew's genetic material. The Cerulean Cave is where Mewtwo made its home after escaping the laboratory. These are the two most significant locations in the story of Mew's cloning. And in the game that allows players to find Ditto in the wild, those locations are where Ditto lives. The theory that assembles all of this evidence goes as follows. When the scientists at the Pokémon Mansion began their project to clone and modify Mew's DNA in order to create a more powerful Pokémon, the successful result was Mewtwo. But Mewtwo, as the journals make clear, was the culmination of a long and difficult process involving many attempts. The text specifically describes Mewtwo as the first successful clone, not the only attempt. The failures went somewhere, and what a failed attempt to clone Mew might produce. A creature that inherited Mew's ability to access the complete genetic library of all Pokémon, and therefore use Transform, but that lacked the power, complexity, and individuality that defined both the original and the successful clone, is exactly what Ditto is. Simple, common. capable of the one trick that Mew could do but none of its stated achievements. A copy without a self. The most technically minded version of this theory has also noted that the data structure for Mew and Ditto in the original game code are more similar to each other than either is to any other Pokémon, suggesting that one may have been built using the other as a template. Mew was famously added to the original games very late in development, inserted by programmer Shigeki Morimoto into a corner of memory that the debugging tools weren't checking, hidden so thoroughly that even Game Freak's own team was unaware it was there until after the games shipped. This late addition raises the question of which creature came first in the development process. If Ditto was designed earlier and Mew was built using Ditto's structure as a starting point, and then elaborated upon, then the relationship between them may not be clone original in the narrative sense, but rather code template in the developmental sense, with the same result. Two creatures whose fundamental design shares a common origin. The breeding mechanic that Ditto received in Gold and Silver adds another layer. Ditto can breed with almost any Pokémon regardless of species, gender, or egg group. It is the universal partner, the one creature that the game's breeding system treats as compatible with everything. This property was explicitly designed to make certain Pokémon that would otherwise be difficult to breed more accessible, developers filling a practical game design need. But the choice to give this specific property to the specific Pokémon, the one whose statistics and appearance and transformative ability all suggest a connection to the creature described as containing the DNA of every other Pokémon in the world, feels like it carries narrative weight. If you accept the theory, then Ditto's ability to breed with any species is a degraded echo of Mew's ability to contain any species. The clone can combine with everything because the original contains everything. The clone doesn't contain, it just connects. The most remarkable thing about this theory is not that it exists. Fan theories about Pokémon are numerous and often elaborate. What is remarkable is that it has never been addressed in any official capacity by the Pokémon Company, Game Freak, or Nintendo in almost 30 years. No Pokédex entry has ever used the word Mew in Ditto's description. No game has ever included a character who acknowledges the possibility of a connection. No interview has produced a developer willing to confirm or deny. The careful absence of acknowledgement has itself become part of the theory, evidence of either deliberate narrative design or a studied corporate avoidance of a fan interpretation that was never intended. There is one version of this theory that takes it in a direction that most people don't go, and it is worth considering. What if Ditto is not the failed clone? What if the relationship is reversed? What if Mew was built from Ditto's template? Game Freak in the early game design documents may have designed Ditto first as a transformative Pokémon and then, late in development, added Mew as an elaboration of that concept, a more complex and powerful version of the same basic idea, possessing all the qualities Ditto has and adding to them the mythology of the ancestor, the DNA library, the rarity. Under this reading, Ditto is not a failed attempt to replicate something that came before it. Ditto is the original, and Mew is the perfected version. The simple blob that people deposit in their PC to use for breeding might be the most genuinely ancient thing in the entire game. Nobody knows. The Pokémon Company isn't saying. After 30 years, the two pink creatures at the heart of this question are still keeping their secret, one in the tall grass and one in the mythology, and they are doing it with perfect, practiced silence. Section 4. The Cubone-Kangaskhan Connection. One of the saddest stories in Pokémon history. The Pokédex entry for Cubone, written in 1996 for Pokémon Red and Blue, is one of the most emotionally direct things Nintendo has ever officially published. It says that Cubone wears the skull of its deceased mother, that it wears it as a helmet, that the skull fits perfectly over Cubone's small head because the skull came from the creature that Cubone used to be, before its mother died and left it alone. And Cubone took the only piece of its mother it still had access to and put it on its head because it could not bear to let go. The entry continues. When Cubone cries, the sound resonates inside the skull, producing a hollow echo that sounds like the sobs of its dead mother. When the moon is full, the pattern of shadows in the skull's eye sockets resembles the face of Cubone's mother, and Cubone cries harder. Cubone cries often and alone. Cubone's back, its Pokédex notes, is always wet with tears. This is extraordinary content for a game aimed at children in 1996. Satoshi Tajiri, when asked about Kubone's design concept in an early interview, said that the Pokémon was inspired by the thought of how sad it would be for a Pokémon to die, and for the creature left behind to have to carry that absence. The design translated that feeling directly into physical form. Cubone does not grieve metaphorically. Cubone grieves by wearing grief. The skull it carries is grief made solid and placed on its head every morning. In the context of Lavender Town and the Pokémon Tower, Cubone's tragedy becomes even more specific. The Pokémon Tower arc involves a Marowak, the evolved form of Cubone, who was murdered by Team Rocket while trying to protect her child from being captured. Her ghost haunts the floors above where players can initially see. Her Cubone cannot leave the tower, locked in a grief that mirrors the mechanical reality of the dungeon structure. The player's journey up the tower is the process of confronting this grief, understanding what happened, and finding a way to acknowledge it that allows the spirit to move on. It is one of the most effectively structured emotional arcs in the original games, accomplished with minimal text and no direct character development. The established story is canonical, well-supported, and genuinely moving. The Marowak is Cubone's mother. She died protecting her child. And yet there is a theory, old and persistent and with more supporting evidence than most casual observers realize, that suggests this official story is at best incomplete. The theory proposes that Cubone is not the child of a Marowak at all. Cubone is an orphaned baby, Kangaskhan, wearing the skull of its Kangaskhan parent. And if that theory is correct, then the apparent Pokémon species of Cubone's mother, Marowak, may be what Cubone eventually becomes after growing up wearing its mother's bones, not what its mother was. The visual argument is where the theory starts, and it is genuinely difficult to dismiss once you see it. A baby Kangaskhan, the small creature that peeks out from the front pouch of the parent, has a body shape, head proportions, ear shape, limb structure, and general silhouette that closely mirrors Cubone. Not in the way that many Pokémon share vague similarities, but specifically in the way that two Pokémon that belong to the same family share specific design language. The head of an adult Kangaskhan, round and slightly elongated with distinctive protrusions, matches the skull that Cubone wears with a precision that fan artists and researchers have been documenting for decades. The specific shape of the eye holes in Cubone's helmet, the contours of the cheek areas, the overall structure of the skull, all correspond more closely to a Kangaskhan's head than to a Marowak's. The behavioral evidence within the games is equally striking. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, Game Freak introduced a mechanic called SOS calling, which allows wild Pokémon to summon allies when they are in battle and running low on health. In the vast majority of cases, a Pokémon summons either another member of its own species or a member of a related evolutionary family, because the mechanic is meant to represent creatures calling on their kin for help. When Cubone calls for help in the wild, one of the Pokémon that may answer the call is Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan has no established evolutionary relationship to Cubone or Marowak. Under the normal logic of the SOS system, Kangaskhan should not respond to Cubone's call. And yet the game code specifically includes Kangaskhan as a valid SOS partner for Cubone in multiple generations and multiple games, without ever explaining why. The coding evidence from the original generation is more technical and more speculative, but worth laying out. Some researchers examining the data structure of Pokémon Red and Blue have identified what appear to be anomalies in the evolutionary sequence around the Cubone and Marowak data slots. Specifically, the presence of references to Kangaskhan in sections of the code that should not need to reference it. The glitch Pokémon known as M, a cousin of sorts to Missing No, that occupies a different empty slot in the Pokémon roster, can, when leveled through certain glitch methods, evolve into Kangaskhan. Researchers who believe the Cubone-Kangaskhan theory interpret this as a residual trace of code that once specified a Marowak to Kangaskhan evolution, code that was removed from the normal execution path but not entirely purged from the data. The ghost of an evolutionary connection that was cut, leaving its outline in the glitch. The fully assembled theory proposes that the original design for these creatures involved a three-stage evolutionary line. Cubone was an orphaned baby Kangaskhan, wearing its parents' skull. Cubone evolved into Marowak, a creature that had processed some portion of its grief and become stronger for it. And Marowak eventually evolved into an adult Kangaskhan, a creature that had fully recovered and was now itself capable of having a child and protecting it. The cycle would close. The orphaned child would eventually become the protective parent, completing a story about grief and recovery and the continuation of love across generations. This design, the theory argues, was deemed too dark for the market. The image of a baby wearing its dead parent's skull and wielding its dead parent's bones as weapons, released as the main mechanic of a popular children's game, was apparently a step beyond what the relevant decision-makers were comfortable with, and so the evolutionary connection was severed. Kangaskhan became a standalone creature with no evolutionary family. Marowak became a dead end, and the only traces left of the original plan were in the SOS call data, in the glitch behaviors, in the visual similarities that fans kept noticing and pointing to, in the name Bonemerang, which is a fusion of the word bone and the word boomerang, which is itself an Australian Aboriginal throwing weapon, most commonly associated with hunting kangaroos. The Space World 1997 leak gave this theory its most direct, though still unofficial, piece of supporting evidence. Among the many beta Pokémon designs in the leaked demo was a Marowak variant that was depicted carrying a small child, visually bridging the gap between the canonical Marowak design and Kangaskhan's maternal aesthetic. The presence of this design in an official Nintendo demo, regardless of whether it was ever intended for the final game, confirms at minimum that the idea of a Marowak associated with a Kangaskhan-like parental dynamic was present in the development process at some point. What the theory implies about Cubone, if it is correct, is both darker and more hopeful than the official story allows. Darker because it means that not only was Cubone's mother murdered, she was murdered in a form that Cubone will eventually grow into. The creature you become is the creature you lost. Every Cubone carries not just the memory of a dead parent, but a future that mirrors its tragedy at the level of its own species. And more hopeful because the evolution into Kangaskhan, if it was ever intended to happen, meant that the grief had a destination. That you could eventually put the skull down, not because you forgot, but because you had become something strong enough to protect the next generation, because the cycle had turned and it was your turn to be the parent instead of the orphan. The theory has never been confirmed. It may never be confirmed. The Pokémon Company has addressed neither the visual similarities nor the SOS call behavior in any public statement. But the evidence accumulates in a particular direction, and the story it tells, if you follow that direction, is one of the most humanly resonant things the franchise has accidentally produced in 30 years of existence. Section 5, Ash's Father, the absence that shaped a generation. There is a man who does not exist in Pokémon, and who has been theorized about more extensively than most characters who do. When the anime began in 1997, it introduced viewers to Ash Ketchum, a 10-year-old from Pallet Town who overslept on the morning he was supposed to collect his first Pokémon. His mother Delia woke him up. She cooked breakfast and waved goodbye from the gate. She was cheerful and warm and uncomplicated, in the way that absent figures of parental responsibility are sometimes written when the story doesn't want to spend time explaining how they work. She was a mother. She cared for her son. She sent him into the world with a good breakfast and an extra set of underwear. She was also, very conspicuously, alone. There was no second parent in the frame, no photograph on the wall, no mention in the morning's conversation. The house had the comfortable, slightly cluttered quality of a home run by one person for a long time, a person who had gotten used to managing everything herself. Delia Ketchum was a single mother, or something that functioned as one, and the story of who had left and why was not part of the episode's agenda. In the second episode of the anime, the subject was briefly touched. Delia mentioned, in a comment designed to encourage Ash as he struggled on the road to Viridian City, that his father had taken 3 days to make the same journey when he started. The implication was that Ash's father had also been a Pokémon trainer, had also set out from Pallet Town on a journey, and was being invoked as a measure against which Ash could compare himself. The father existed. He had been there once, he was not there now. And then, for most of the anime's early years, the subject was dropped entirely. Over the course of more than 20 seasons, the father was referenced perhaps a handful of times in total. Delia occasionally mentioned, in the vaguest possible terms, that Ash's father and grandfather were both out on journeys of their own. A storyboard artist who worked on the anime said in an interview that Ash's father was a Pokémon trainer who had left on a journey and never returned, and that this was the show's general explanation for his absence. The original head writer of the anime, Takeshi Shudo, who wrote the early seasons before stepping away from the show, published a novelization in which he described the father as a man who had left Pallet Town to pursue a Pokémon journey and simply never came back. In the novel, this was presented as a kind of tragic character detail, a man so consumed by the pursuit of adventure that he had not managed to stay present for the family he left behind. These details painted a portrait, but a vague one. The father was a trainer. He had started from Pallet Town. He had been on a journey for at least 10 years. He might be anywhere in the world. The speculation began almost immediately. The first and most persistent candidate in the fan community was Professor Oak. The logic was straightforward. Oak played the role of a father figure to Ash throughout the anime, offering encouragement and support and wisdom that Ash received from no other adult male in his life. Oak had a close relationship with Delia that went beyond the usual Pokémon professor arrangement, appearing at the Ketchum household with some regularity and being treated with a warmth that felt familially comfortable. Oak had given Ash his first Pokémon, a specific Pikachu that was more powerful and more connected to Ash than any randomly assigned starter should have been. And Oak shared, with Ash, an enthusiasm for Pokémon that felt, to some fans, like something that had been passed down rather than independently developed. The counter to the Oak theory is that Oak's grandchild, Gary Oak, is Ash's established rival, and the writers never built in any hint that Ash and Gary were related at a remove. Gary and Ash would essentially be cousins in this scenario, and the show's treatment of their rivalry doesn't seem aware of any such connection. The theory also requires that Oak kept the secret for the entirety of the anime, which seems inconsistent with his characterization as a generally straightforward and honest person. The second major theory was darker and more dramatically satisfying. Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, the principal villain of the original story arc. In the Pokémon live stage musical, a production that carried some official status, even though it contradicted or elaborated on the main anime in ways that were never reconciled, Delia delivered a song in which she revealed that she had once dated Giovanni when she was young. This was the closest any official piece of Pokémon media had ever come to establishing a specific romantic history for Ash's mother. The Giovanni theory took this revelation and extended it. If Delia had dated Giovanni before Ash was born, and if the relationship had ended under circumstances that resulted in Ash existing, but Giovanni not being present, then the possibility that Giovanni was Ash's biological father was, at minimum, not contradicted by the official material. The theory gained additional circumstantial support from Team Rocket's behavior throughout the anime. Jesse and James received resources and support from Giovanni through hundreds of episodes and dozens of regions, despite never successfully completing a single mission. The standard explanation in the show was that Giovanni tolerated them because of various organizational reasons, or because they occasionally provided him with information. But fans who believed the Giovanni theory had a different explanation. Giovanni knew that Ash was his son. Team Rocket wasn't really trying to capture Ash's Pikachu. It was keeping watch on a child its boss was unwilling to either acknowledge or abandon. The repeated failures were feature, not bug. When Giovanni and Ash finally met in person during the Black and White season, after more than a decade of the anime, the encounter was unremarkable. Giovanni showed no sign of recognizing Ash as anything other than a problem to be dealt with. There was no flicker of suppressed emotion, no line of dialogue that could be read as ambiguous, no visual storytelling that suggested the meeting meant more than its surface content. Fans who believed the theory argued that Giovanni would be exactly the type of person to maintain perfect composure in that situation. Fans who didn't argued that the writers had simply never committed to the theory, and the meeting confirmed as much. The most dramatically satisfying engagement the anime ever had with the question of Ash's father came late in the series. in a special episode titled The Distant Blue Sky. In the episode, Delia contacted Ash to tell him she was going to meet his father in a specific town. For a moment, after more than 25 years of narrative silence on the subject, it appeared that the show was going to provide an answer. Ash was in the region. The meeting was scheduled. The father existed and was coming to a place Ash could reach. And then Ash got caught up in an adventure, as Ash always does, and by the time the situation resolved, the father had already come and gone. He had met Delia. He had missed Ash. He had left a present, a hat, specifically one of Ash's iconic caps, identical to the one Ash already wore. The show had the opportunity to give the character a name, a face, a voice, a single detail, and it gave the audience a hat. The question it had been building toward for a quarter century produced not an answer, but a symbol of itself. The people who produce and have produced the Pokémon anime have been occasionally honest about the situation in interviews. The explanation that appears most often from various sources over the years is that Ash's father was never concretely defined because the story was never concretely built around him. The character is absent because the story didn't need him to be present. And by the time the franchise was large enough that someone might think to ask, the absence had already become an established feature that creating any answer would disrupt. In some sense, that might be the truest answer. Ash's father is absent because Ash's story works without him. The theme of the anime from its first season through Ash's eventual ascent to world champion was always about what a child builds through his own effort and the connections he makes along the way. Not about inheritance, not about legacy, not about the weight of parental expectation. The father being missing means that Ash's achievements are entirely his own. There is no father to live up to and no father to fall short of. The absence is structural, not sentimental. It is the space that lets Ash be exactly who he is without comparison. The mystery of Ash's father was never intended to be solved, and in the end, it was never solved. The person most affected by this, the fictional 10-year-old from Pallet Town who grew up to be world champion without ever meeting the person who should have been standing in the front row, appears to have managed this just fine. Perhaps the answer was always in the hat that was left behind. Not the explanation, but the acknowledgement. The father was there in some form, leaving what he knew how to leave. And that has to be enough because it is all there is. Section 6. The Rivals Raticate. Did you kill it? Of all the fan theories discussed in this video, this one is perhaps the most quietly devastating because of how simple it is. It doesn't require elaborate interpretation of hidden code or obscure cultural references. It requires only that you pay attention to the sequence of events in Pokémon Red and Blue and allow yourself to follow them to their logical conclusion. Your rival has a Raticate. You fight him on the SS Anne, the luxury cruise ship docked in Vermilion City, maybe a third of the way through the game. This is one of several mandatory rival battles, and it's a meaningful one because the ship is crowded and the battle takes place in the middle of an ongoing chaotic scenario. Other trainers moving around, the ship about to depart. Your rival's Raticate is among the most dangerous Pokémon in his roster at this point in the game. It is fast and hits hard, the kind of evolved early game Pokémon that catches players off guard if they're not paying attention. You beat it because you always beat your rival and you move on. The next time you encounter your rival is in Lavender Town. You've come there as part of the story to investigate the haunted Pokémon Tower. The tower is a cemetery. It is the place where people bring their Pokémon to be buried when they die. It is the most explicitly grief-focused location in the entire game. You are making your way through the floors of that tower when your rival appears in front of you. He does not have his Raticate. He has 5 Pokémon instead of 6. He looks at your party and makes a comment about how your Pokémon don't look dead, as if he has some reference point for what it looks like when a trainer's Pokémon are dead. As if the thing that brings you to a Pokémon graveyard is the reason he is also there. He fights you, because that's what your rival does. And then the game moves on and never directly addresses what just happened. The absence of the Raticate from his party after the SS Anne is a fact. The fact that the next encounter after the ship battle takes place in a Pokémon graveyard is a fact. The fact that your rivals comment about dead Pokémon is the closest the game comes to an explanation for why he is there is a fact. Everything else is interpretation. The interpretation that has resonated with players for nearly 3 decades is this one. Raticate was badly injured in the battle on the SS Anne. The ship was chaotic, crowded, in the process of being boarded and departed from by dozens of people. Getting to a Pokémon Center quickly enough in the chaos of Vermilion City at a moment when the landmark cruise liner was docking and the crowds were thick was not possible in time. And so the Raticate died. Your rival brought it to Lavender Town. And when he confronted you in the Pokémon Tower, he was at the grave of a partner whose death you had indirectly caused. The reason this theory has never died, despite the very reasonable counter-argument that Game Freak simply adjusted the rival's team for game balance purposes, and that nothing narratively significant was intended, is that it tells a story that the games don't tell anywhere else. Pokémon Red and Blue are games about catching and training and battling, but they are carefully insulated from the permanent consequences of those actions. Pokémon faint, but they never die. Trainers are defeated, but never harmed. The world is constructed to make the protagonist's journey feel consequence-free, because consequence would complicate the heroic narrative that the game is built around. The Raticate theory cuts through that insulation. It says the battle on the ship had consequences you didn't see. The creature you defeated was not simply returned to full health at the next Pokémon Center. It was a living thing that your victory may have killed. And the arrogant rival who has been your antagonist through every gym badge, who has always been ahead of you and always been contemptuous of you, was standing in a cemetery because of what happened between you. And he faced you there, and he fought you there, because that is how he deals with grief, which is the only way he knows how to deal with anything. That story makes your rival deeper. It makes the Pokémon Tower darker. It makes the battle on the SS Anne retrospectively heavier. The way certain moments in your own life can become heavier when you find out later what they led to. The game did not necessarily plan for any of this. But the game created the conditions for this reading, and the reading is there for anyone willing to look at the sequence of events in that particular way. Whether or not the Raticate was actually killed, the theory has done something real to the franchise. Players who accept it can never board the SS Anne with the same lightness they had before. They cannot walk through Lavender Town without a particular awareness. They cannot look at their rival's team count without doing the arithmetic. The theory is a lens, and once you've worn it, you cannot take it off. That is what the best theories do. They don't tell you what happened. They change what you see when you look at what you know. The rival eventually became a gym leader, the most surprising character arc in the original games. A child who was defined entirely by arrogance and aggression, becoming a person responsible for guiding other trainers. Something changed him. Something made him understand what he had been missing in his approach to Pokémon, what he had lost by treating them as tools rather than companions. The games never tell us what that something was. But for the players who believe the Raticate theory, the answer has always been obvious. It was a ship, a battle, a failure to reach a Pokémon Center in time. It was the weight of a loss that he never talked about except to ask a rival in a graveyard whether they knew what it felt like to have a Pokémon die by the eye. He knew what it felt like. He had learned in Vermilion City or on the road to Lavender Town, and the learning shaped everything that came after. Section 7. Arceus and the Creation Myth. What was before the beginning? In the Canaleve Library of the Sinnoh region, written in the pages of a book that players can find during their exploration of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl, there is a passage called The Original Story. It describes the beginning of everything. It says that in the beginning, there was only a churning tumult of chaos, that nothing existed in any form that could be perceived or measured. And then, from within that chaos, an egg appeared. The egg hatched. And what emerged from the egg was Arceus. Arceus then shaped the chaos. It created Dialga, and Dialga gave the world time. It created Palkia, and Palkia gave the world space. From space and time came matter, from matter came the world. And the world began to form into something that could be inhabited. Later, Arceus created 3 more Pokémon, the Lake Trio, Uxie and Mesprit and Azelf, and from them came knowledge and emotion and the force of will that makes action possible. And when all of this was done, Arceus rested. This is, in the structure of its mythology, a recognizable kind of creation story. There are ancient traditions from cultures around the world that describe a creator deity emerging from a cosmic egg into a void, hatching into the first light and then setting about making the conditions for everything else. The Hindu Brahmanda, the golden world egg, the Orphic egg of ancient Greek cosmogony. The Pangu myth of early Chinese cosmology. The creation egg appears wherever human civilizations have looked at the question of ultimate origin and tried to give it a shape. Game Freak borrowed that structure and applied it to Pokémon, which is a perfectly sensible creative decision. The structure works. The myth lands. The world of Pokémon feels, because of it, like it has genuine depth. But the question the myth does not answer, the question that mythology of this type almost never answers, is the one that a child with access to the text asks immediately. If Arceus came from the egg, what made the egg? The franchise has never addressed this. It cannot. The question is, in a strict logical sense, unanswerable within the framework of any creation mythology, because the point of a creation mythology is to provide a start point, and a start point by definition cannot have a prior cause within the mythology's own logic. The egg was the first thing. There was nothing before it. The chaos that preceded the egg had no structure, no agency, no capacity to produce anything intentionally. The egg simply was in the way that first things simply are, and Arceus hatched from it, and the world followed from that hatching. And yet the question persists because Pokémon has built a universe that is more internally consistent than most and more interested in exploring its own cosmology than most. And the question of what came before the beginning is, in a world with a named god and a documented creation event, more pressing than it would be in a world that simply didn't explain itself. The fans who think most carefully about Pokémon's cosmology have developed several frameworks for sitting with this question. The most common is that Arceus is what physicists might call an uncaused cause, a being that exists outside the causal framework it creates. Time was created by Dialga, who was created by Arceus. Therefore, Arceus predates time, and the question of what came before Arceus is a malformed question, because before implies temporal precedence and time did not exist before Arceus made it. This is consistent with the game's own lore, which specifically states that Arceus created time, and it is the most philosophically stable way to handle the mythology's apparent paradox. But there is a different question that the games do raise and refuse to answer. If Arceus is the creator of all things and the most powerful being in existence, why can it be defeated in battle? Why can a 10-year-old trainer with a team of level 70 Pokémon challenge the literal creator of the universe and win? The game of Pokémon Legends. Arceus ends with the player fighting Arceus directly and winning, and the narrative treats this as a meaningful triumph rather than an absurdity. Arceus apparently can be hurt. The explanations that fans have developed for this are varied. One argues that Arceus is choosing to allow itself to be challenged, operating within the limits of the competitive framework because it wants to test or evaluate the trainer rather than overpower them. Another argues that what the player fights is not Arceus's full power, but a localized manifestation, an avatar operating at a constrained level rather than the full divine entity. A third argues that Arceus's mortality, its capacity to be harmed, is a feature of its design rather than a limitation, a deliberate choice to remain part of the world it created, rather than existing above and apart from it. All of these explanations work within the game's logic. None of them has been confirmed as the intended reading. Game Freak has been consistently vague about the theological implications of Arceus's existence, which suggests either that the team built the mythology as atmosphere rather than as doctrine, and is content to leave the philosophical holes unfilled, or that they have a more complete internal cosmology that they are deliberately withholding. The Azure Flute mystery adds a specific, practical dimension to the Arceus question that is harder to philosophize away. Diamond and Pearl were designed with a legitimate method to catch Arceus built into the game. The Hall of Origin, a floating platform above the spear pillar where Arceus could be encountered, was accessible through a mystical item called the Azure Flute that was to be distributed through Nintendo events. The hall was coded. The encounter was coded. The Azure Flute was coded. And then when the games launched and events began rolling out, the Azure Flute was never distributed. Nintendo ran various events during the lifespan of Diamond and Pearl that distributed special Pokémon and items. The Azure Flute was not among them. Arceus was eventually distributed separately, through other events and through the promotion of the film Arceus and the Jewel of Life, but always as a direct gift rather than through the Hall of Origin experience that had been specifically designed for it. The Hall of Origin remained unreachable through legitimate means for the entire lifespan of the original games. Players who found it through hacking or device manipulation reported a unique encounter and dialogue that implied a significance to the location that went beyond a simple catch encounter, dialogue about the nature of the universe and Arceus's place in it that was not part of any other Arceus encounter in the franchise. Game Freak has never explained why the Azure Flute was never distributed, why the Hall of Origin event was designed and then withheld. The most pragmatic explanation is that the event was cut from the distribution schedule due to logistical issues or a change in the game's marketing plan. The kind of thing that happens regularly in large-scale consumer product rollouts without any deeper significance. But the Hall of Origin's existence as a designed space with specific dialogue suggests that it was intended to be more than just a catch location, that it was designed to add something to the player's understanding of Arceus and of the game's mythology, and that whatever that something was, it has never been experienced by the vast majority of players who played the original games. Arceus is described in its Pokédex entry as a Pokémon said to have configured the world out of nothing before the appearance of light, a being that shaped the chaos that preceded existence into the ordered universe that followed. Its name combines roots from multiple languages, the Latin for golden, the Greek for origin, the beginning of the alphabet, the name of the highest gods in multiple traditions. Every part of its identity is pointed toward primacy, toward being the first of everything, toward the before that nothing preceded. And yet its true name, as it tells the player in Pokémon Legends Arceus, has no equivalent in human language. The name Arceus is what humans decided to call it, a word that approximates something that cannot be fully expressed. The creator of language cannot be named in language. The first thing resists being defined by the things that came after it. This is, for a Pokémon game, a remarkably sophisticated piece of theological thinking, and it raises a question that has no answer and is perhaps more powerful for having none. What was there before the egg? Something that had no name and produced no record and left no trace except the fact of everything that came after it. The absence that made the beginning possible. The silence that preceded the first sound. Whatever it was, it will never be put in a Pokédex. It will never be caught. It cannot be known. And in a franchise built on the premise that everything can be caught, that complete knowledge is a thing worth pursuing, that mystery can be approached even if it can't be eliminated, the existence of something permanently beyond reach is perhaps the most interesting thing that Pokémon ever accidentally created. Section 8. The Unknown. Ancient language or ancient god? There is a set of Pokémon that should be the least interesting creatures in the franchise. They have base stats so uniformly low that using one in competitive play is essentially conceding the match before it starts. They know one move, and that move, called Hidden Power, functions differently for every individual Pokémon, which is interesting in theory but in practice means you cannot reliably predict what you're getting. They cannot evolve, they cannot breed. They serve no obvious narrative function beyond filling a Pokédex slot and giving players in certain specific areas something to hunt. And yet, if you read carefully through the franchise's lore, if you follow the threads that connect the unknown to the creation mythology, to the ancient ruins, to the deepest cosmological events the games describe, you start to realize that these unremarkable, flat, letter-shaped creatures might be more central to the universe's fundamental structure than anything else in the Pokédex, including Arceus. The unknown were introduced in Pokémon Gold and Silver, taking the form of each letter of the Latin alphabet, appearing plastered against the stone walls of the ruins of Alph near Violet City. Their Pokédex entries were from the beginning characterized by what they didn't say, by the careful hedging of a franchise that wanted to establish mystery without committing to resolution. They resemble ancient writing. It is unknown whether they preceded human language or were inspired by it. They seem to communicate but through an unclear mechanism, either electromagnetic waves or pure telepathy, with the game's own researchers unable to agree on which. They are described as living inside their own dimension and rarely venturing into the world humans know. The ruins of Alph themselves are a location the games have never fully explained. They are ancient. They contain slide puzzles that, when completed, open hidden chambers with additional unknown shapes. The walls of those chambers contain messages written in unknown script, words like escape and light and water. Nobody has ever confirmed who wrote these messages. The scientists studying the ruins say only that there is more here than meets the eye, that the puzzles must be related to something important. They offer no answers. The ruins keep their secrets. In the Japanese version of Pokémon Crystal, a scientist working at the ruins of Alph makes an observation that was translated but then cut from the English release. She notes that Unknown began appearing in the ruins around the same time that the Goldenrod City Pokémon Communication Center began broadcasting radio waves. The implication is that Unknown can be summoned or awakened by certain types of electromagnetic transmission, that the broadcast infrastructure of the modern world resonates with whatever frequency the Unknown operate on. This detail was removed from the international release and has never been revisited in any subsequent game. But it is the only piece of official material that suggests a connection between Unknown and contemporary human technology, which would be relevant if you believed, as some fans do, that the Unknown are not merely ancient curiosities but active participants in the ongoing maintenance of the world's structure. The movie that gave Unknown their most significant narrative role was the third Pokémon film, Spell of the Unknown, released in 2000 and titled Entei, Lord of the Unknown Tower in its Japanese version. The plot of the film involves a young girl named Molly Hale whose father disappeared while conducting research into the unknown. When Molly discovers a box of unknown tiles and begins playing with them, something responds to the depth of her grief and her wish for a family. The unknown, gathering in the ruins beneath her home, begin to manifest reality. They construct a crystal palace around the Hale mansion. They conjure an Entei that speaks to Molly and functions as a surrogate father. They generate entire weather systems. And as the film progresses, the manifestation grows increasingly unstable. The unknown generating more energy than the physical world can absorb, threatening to expand the dream until it consumes everything around it. The film's resolution involves Molly being reunited with her real father, her needs being met by reality rather than by the unknown's constructed version of it. When the genuine need is addressed, the unknown's energy dissipates and the crystal palace dissolves. The creatures that had been generating all of this world-altering power simply float away, dispersing as the conditions that had called them into concentrated action pass. What the film establishes, beyond its surface-level plot, is that unknown are responsive. They do not originate action. They amplify and manifest existing emotional states or desires, transforming the intensity of human feeling into physical reality. A child's grief for her father, given sufficient emotional weight, becomes a palace and a false Entei and a threat to the surrounding world. The unknown are not acting on their own agenda. They are reflecting back what they receive, at a scale and power that nothing in the natural world should be capable of. This characterization of the unknown as responsive rather than active connects to their role in the game's cosmology in a way that has generated extensive theoretical discussion. In Pokémon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, if the player carries a special event Arceus into the Sinjoh ruins, a remote location connecting the Johto and Sinnoh regions, a cinematic event plays. Arceus calls the unknown. They come from across the ruins, their many forms gathering from the walls and the air, converging in a swirling mass around the god Pokémon. Arceus then uses the gathered energy of the unknown to create an egg from which one of the creation legendaries hatches. Dialga, or Palkia, or Giratina can be born in this event. The creation of legendary Pokémon, the process of bringing a being of that power into the world, requires Arceus and the unknown together. This is the detail that most compels the fans who believe the unknown are more than incidental. Arceus is described as the creator of everything, the being from which all existence flows. And yet Arceus, in the game's actual mechanics, cannot create a legendary Pokémon without the unknown's participation. The god of everything needs the alphabet-shaped creatures to do the act of creation. They are, in this scene, the instruments of divine power, the medium through which will become's world. They are not the creator, but without them, the creator cannot create. The theory that follows from this is that the unknown are the language of the universe rather than participants within it. Not creatures in the conventional sense, but the symbols through which reality was written. When Arceus shaped the chaos into existence, it did so in the unknown's alphabet, and the unknown are that alphabet made physical, the letters of the original text that have since developed something like individual existence while remaining fundamentally what they have always been, which is the building blocks of everything. The ruins where they cluster are not places they chose to live. They are places where the writing came closest to the surface, where the original text bleeds through into the visible world. Under this reading, their signature move is almost unbearably apt. Hidden Power. A move whose type is determined by something invisible inside the Pokémon, something that cannot be assessed from the outside, but that drives the nature of the force it produces. Different for every individual, unknowable until used. The letters of the universe containing hidden power of a type that cannot be predicted, that shapes itself to what the moment needs. Of course, that is the only move they know. What else would the building blocks of existence need to do? Game Freak has never confirmed any of this. The Unknown's Pokédex entries remain carefully vague. The researchers in the games remain puzzled. The question of whether Unknown preceded or followed written language remains officially open, and that careful openness may itself be the most deliberate thing about them. Some questions are more valuable as questions than as answers. The Unknown have been sitting in the ruins for 30 years, silent and flat against the walls, and every few years someone comes and looks at them and tries to read what they're saying, and the walls stay quiet, and the mystery deepens, and the game earns its atmosphere without spending a single word. Section 9. The Gold and Silver Beta. The world that almost was. In May of 2018, someone posted 4 ROM files to the Discord server of a group of Pokémon enthusiasts who spent their time reverse engineering the game code. The files were presented without explanation, with minimal context, under an anonymous name. They were binary data from prototype versions of Pokémon Gold and Silver, specifically from a demo build that had been shown to the public at Nintendo Space World in 1997, more than 2 years before the finished games reached Japanese stores. The files spread from the Discord to the cutting room floor, a website dedicated to documenting cut and unused content in video games, where a team of researchers began working through the data. What they found was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the history of the franchise. The Space World 1997 demo of Pokémon Gold and Silver contained approximately 100 Pokémon designs that no player had ever seen before because they had never made it into the final game. Of the 251 creatures in the game's eventual roster, roughly 40 were entirely absent from the demo, replaced by different creatures with different designs, names, and types. At least 29 of the Pokémon that did survive from demo to final game were significantly different in their earlier form, showing major design changes between the prototype and the shipped product. The sheer volume of cut and altered content was described by one researcher as overwhelming, a word that understated what they were actually looking at. The starter Pokémon for the Johto region in the demo were completely different from the creatures players eventually received. The fire starter was not Cyndaquil. The water starter was not Totodile. The grass starter was not Chikorita. The designs that eventually became the beloved starters of the second generation were, in the Space World demo, nowhere to be found in the forms players know. Several of the early starter designs bore resemblances to the final starters in terms of type and general aesthetic, but the creatures themselves were visually distinct enough to be functionally different species. Among the most striking and emotionally resonant discoveries were the baby Pokémon designs. The demo contained 10 baby Pokémon that were cut before the game released, pre-evolved forms of Generation 1 Pokémon that would have created new evolutionary connections. There was a baby Meowth, a small, round, kitten-like creature that would have been the pre-evolution of Meowth, in the same way that Cleffa and Igglybuff were pre-evolutions of their respective lines. There was a baby Vulpix, a pre-evolution for the fan-favorite fox Pokémon. There were pre-evolved forms of Drowsy and Shelder and other established creatures. The presence of these cuts suggests that Game Freak's original vision for Gold and Silver involved establishing many more connections between the second generation and the original roster, building a sense of continuity and expansion that the final game only partially achieved. Girafarig, the Generation 2 giraffe Pokémon whose name is a palindrome reading the same forward and backward, appeared in the demo as a genuinely two-headed creature with a full second head on its tail. Not the small auxiliary face of the final design, but a complete, distinct head facing the opposite direction from the primary one. The palindromic name was designed for this version, a creature defined by its bidirectional quality, having a name that reads the same both ways. The final Girafarig kept the name but simplified the concept, and the palindrome became a puzzle, a linguistic hint at a design that no longer fully expressed it. Finding the demo design explained something that players had wondered about for 20 years. Porygon 2's demo design was so different from its final form that researchers initially wondered if it belonged to the same line. The early version resembled a small lion surrounded by floating spheres, an almost organic design compared to the clean digital aesthetic of the final creature, which is all sharp angles and explicitly artificial geometry. The shift from the proto-organic lion design to the definitively digital polygon shape tells a story about how Game Freak's concept for Porygon 2 clarified between the demo and the finished game, moving toward a more deliberate expression of the creature's identity as an artificial entity, rather than something that looked like it had evolved naturally. Among the most discussed finds was a beta Marowak design that appeared to show the creature carrying a small child, bridging the visual language of the canonical Marowak, defined by bones and grief, with the maternal imagery of Kangaskhan. For the fans who had long believed in the Cubone-Kangaskhan connection, discussed earlier in this video, the discovery was extraordinary. Here, in an official Nintendo demo, was a design that seemed to show exactly what the theory predicted. A Marowak that had grown up and was now carrying the next generation rather than wearing the bones of the previous one. Whether this was a design sketch for the final evolutionary stage in a planned three-stage line, or a coincidental design similarity, nobody at Game Freak has confirmed, but its presence in the demo gave the theory more official grounding than it had ever previously possessed. The demo also contained a creature called Kotura, an electric tiger cub, one of the most discussed cut Pokémon in the community's response to the leak. The design was appealing in a way that many fans found difficult to explain. A clean, simple design with a strong typological concept, the kind of Pokémon that seems like it should have existed. Its absence from the final game has been cited by fans as an example of how the cuts to the Generation 2 roster weren't purely about quality, that some of the removed creatures were removed for reasons of scope or balance that had nothing to do with whether the design was good. The leak also contained what appeared to be internal communications, emails and notes between Game Freak staff and external contacts at Nintendo, none of which contained dramatic revelations about the development process, but all of which provided an unusually direct view of what it looked like when a small, ambitious team was trying to build one of the most anticipated game sequels in history. The communications were mundane in the way that most working documents are mundane, full of scheduling concerns and practical problems, and the specific, unglamorous language of game development under pressure. But their mundanity was itself meaningful. The games that shaped the childhoods of millions of people were built by people with email addresses and meeting schedules, and the same kinds of practical concerns that shape any creative project. The magic was real, and the people who made it were also just people. The full significance of the Space World leak extends beyond the Pokémon designs it revealed. It documented the existence of a version of Pokémon Gold and Silver that was substantially different from the games that were eventually shipped. A version that had been hinted at in early promotional materials, and then quietly abandoned as the development process moved toward its conclusion. That version had different starters, different evolutionary lines, different creatures filling the Johto roster, a different vision of what the second generation would be. The games that players know and love, the games that shaped childhoods and are now treated as definitive cultural artifacts, were not the inevitable expression of the franchise's second chapter. They were one possible version among many, chosen through a process of decisions and compromises that mostly happened without any public record. This is not a revelation unique to Pokémon. Every creative work is chosen from the universe of possible versions of itself. Every film contains scenes that were cut. Every novel contains chapters that were removed. Every game has features that were designed and scrapped before the final product was boxed and shipped. The Space World leak is unusual only in the directness with which it shows us the alternatives, in the clarity with which it lets us see the Girafarig that was supposed to have two complete heads, and the Marowak that was supposed to carry its child forward, instead of wearing its mother backward. What does it mean to love something that was contingent? The Pokémon Gold and Silver you grew up with, the starters you chose, the creatures you trained, the routes you walked at dusk with your team following you? All of it was assembled from choices that could have gone differently. The Johto region you know was built in part from the ruins of the Johto region that never was. The Totodile you started with is lovable in the specific way it is lovable partly because it survived the process that removed 10 other starting designs. The mystery of what the other path would have felt like is ultimately unanswerable. But knowing that the other path existed, knowing that somewhere in a prototype build the two-headed giraffe walks the Johto routes that the palindrome named single-headed giraffe now occupies, makes the world you know feel simultaneously more precious and more fragile. Section 10. The creepypastas that started it all. Buried Alive, White Hand, and the Internet's Dark Myths. We have spent most of this video with mysteries that have genuine ambiguity at their core. Real questions embedded in the official material. Real gaps in the story that Game Freak left open. Real evidence for real theories that have never been officially addressed. But the history of Pokémon's dark mythology would be incomplete without spending time in a different territory. The territory of stories that were entirely fabricated, entirely invented, and yet have proven more culturally persistent than almost anything in the actual canon. These are the creepypastas, the playground legends, the things that your friend's older brother swore were true, that you half believed until you were old enough to check and then found yourself somehow disappointed to discover were false. They are part of Pokémon's history in a way that cannot be removed, and they tell us things about the relationship between nostalgia and fear and the needs of the imagination that the official stories never quite managed to express. The Buried Alive legend is the oldest and most elaborately developed of these. Its core claim is that an early version of Pokémon Red and Blue, before the final product was shipped, contained a boss encounter at the top of the Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town that was removed before release. This boss was not a Pokémon. It was a human figure, or something that had once been human, a decaying corpse that clawed its way out of the ground when the player reached the final floor. The creature was named in the legend's internal documentation as the Buried Alive model, sometimes called by its supposed codename, Berryman. The encounter as described in the most widely circulated version of the legend began when the player walked to the grave or monument at the top of the tower and interacted with it. The Buried Alive would then speak. The dialogue that the legend describes to it runs as follows. "You're here. I'm trapped. And I'm lonely. So very lonely. Won't you join me?" After this, a battle would begin. In the battle view, the creature would be visible, described as a decaying human body partially emerged from the ground, the skin mottled, the eyes white and pupilless, the face locked, in an expression that various accounts describe as either desperate or hungry. Its team included two Pokémon called White Hands, a Gengar, and a Mook. And if the player somehow managed to defeat all of these Pokémon, the game would freeze. There was no winning state coded for the Buried Alive encounter. Defeating it was impossible within the bounds of the game's mechanics. And if the player lost, the game would play a special animation in which the Buried Alive grabbed the player's character and pulled them into the ground, followed by a game over screen featuring an image of the creature consuming the player. The White Hand was its own separate legend that became incorporated into the Buried Alive mythology over time. In the standalone version, the White Hand was a sprite that could be found by pressing against certain walls in the Pokémon Tower. It appeared not as a battle, but as an image, a highly detailed rendering of a pale human hand pressed against the wall, with animations more sophisticated than anything else in the game. The hand moved. Its fingers shifted slowly. The detail was supposedly realistic in a way that no Game Boy sprite had any right to be, and looking at it for too long produced physical symptoms in the viewer, nausea or headache or a creeping wrongness that the legend never quite specified, but that the reader's imagination filled in readily. These stories are false. Researchers who have examined the original game code in detail have found no trace of a buried alive sprite, no white hand graphic, no associated battle mechanics, no dialogue strings matching what the legends describe. The technical claims in the stories fail basic scrutiny. The Game Boy could not download images to its internal memory in the way described. The battle mechanics described for the buried alive encounter are inconsistent with how Generation 1 battles function. The level of sprite detail attributed to the White Hand was not achievable on the original hardware. On every technical level that can be checked, the stories do not hold up, and they have been alive for more than a decade since the debunking was made widely available. They exist in fan art, and in ROM hacks, and in animated recreations, and in comment sections where they are discussed with the specific warmth that attaches to things that were believed in childhood and can no longer be believed but are remembered fondly anyway. The debunking did not kill them. It could not, because the stories serve a purpose that factual accuracy was never required to fulfill. What purpose? Consider the experience of Pokémon Tower before the legends were added to it. The tower is already a graveyard. There is already a dead mother on the upper floors whose ghost cannot leave because she was murdered and nobody acknowledged it. There are already trainers walking in circles on those floors, consumed by grief, unable to look away from the graves. The music that plays in Lavender Town is already that circling melody that won't resolve. The game is already, in its canonical form, doing something unusual and heavy for a franchise aimed at children. The Buried Alive legend did not create the darkness in Pokémon Tower. It gave the existing darkness a specific face. It answered a question the game was already raising, which is, what is the worst thing that could be at the top of this building? The answer the legend offered was a human being, or something that had been one. Something that crossed the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and was now reaching back from the other side, using the language of loneliness to compel the player to join it. The worst thing you could find in a place of death is not a powerful Pokémon or a criminal organization. The worst thing you could find is something that wants company in the dark. Something that will not let you win by fighting it. Something that pulls you in if you lose. The legend also accomplished something specific for the generation of players who encountered it in the early years of the internet. Those players were teenagers and young adults by the time the creepypasta genre emerged online, and they had grown up with a franchise that was designed for children and was still being marketed that way. The gap between the franchise they remembered from childhood, which had felt genuinely strange and atmospheric in certain moments, and the increasingly polished and commercially safe product it had become, was a gap that the creepypastas promised to fill. The legends offered a version of Pokémon that matched the emotional register of those early, unpolished memories. A version that was genuinely dangerous, a version that reached back out of the screen. The persistence of these legends in the face of debunking is not irrationality. It is the rational preference for a story that does something over a truth that does nothing. The truth is that the Pokémon Tower contains no buried alive creature and never did. The truth leaves the tower as a well-designed graveyard in a 1996 video game. The legend gives it a weight and a menace that the truth could not provide. For people who need the tower to be frightening, who need to feel that the game they grew up with was capable of genuine strangeness, the truth is insufficient and the legend is necessary. There is also something genuinely interesting about the moment in the story where the buried alive cannot be defeated. This detail, more than any other, has stayed with fans across decades of retellings. The normal structure of Pokémon games, the structure that defines the entire franchise, is one where all obstacles are ultimately surmountable. Every gym leader can be beaten. Every legendary can be caught. Every challenge has a solution that the player can find if they are skilled or determined enough. The game's promise, its fundamental contract with the player, is that the world can be mastered. The Buried Alive breaks that contract. You cannot win, you can only delay the loss. And when you lose, you are consumed, and the game takes your defeat and writes it permanently into the hardware so that every time you start the game again, you are reminded of it. This is a perfect inversion of everything Pokémon promises. It is the nightmare version of the franchise's foundation, a challenge with no solution, a world where effort and skill and love for your Pokémon count for nothing, because the thing you're facing simply cannot be overcome. It is the game's optimism turned inside out. The legend understood something real about what was frightening. Not monsters with high stats, not attacks that deal large amounts of damage. The frightening thing is the loss of agency, the thing that cannot be escaped, that cannot be bargained with, that will reach across whatever distance exists between the living and the dead and say, "You're here and I'm lonely and you will join me." Not because you were weak, because you came at all. Dozens of other Pokémon creepypastas and legends deserve extended discussion, each revealing something about the anxieties and the needs that the official franchise could not address. Lost Silver, the story of a haunted gold and silver cartridge whose protagonist aged and withered toward an inescapable death. Pokémon Strangled Red, describing a corrupt cartridge where the game itself seemed to be committing acts of cruelty against the creatures within it. The Hypno's Lullaby, a piece of fictional in-universe media depicting a Pokémon using its hypnotic abilities to lure children away from their families. The Ghost Hand creepypasta for Fire Red and Leaf Green. The various theories about ghost-type Pokémon having human origins, about Ghastly and Haunter being the spirits of children who died in the areas where they appear. Every one of these stories expresses something true about what it feels like to be a child in a world that is sometimes frightening and sometimes does not make sense, and sometimes asks things of you that you don't have the tools to handle. Pokémon is a world where children go alone into the wilderness, where they face powerful and strange creatures, where the world is full of things they don't fully understand. The creepypastas are the part of that world that the official franchise admitted existed, but wouldn't fully look at. The legends looked at it. They looked at it on behalf of the children who played the games and felt something in Lavender Town and didn't have the words for it, and needed someone somewhere to give the feeling a shape. None of it happened. All of it was real. Both of those things are true, in the way that good stories are true even when they contain no facts, and that is what the Buried Alive legend is, regardless of whether anyone at Cinnabar Island ever clawed their way out of the ground. It is a story about the part of Pokémon that the franchise never officially acknowledged, but that every player who reached the top of the Pokémon Tower felt. The part that was already there in the circling music, and the ghost of a murdered mother, and the small creature in the skull that could not stop crying. The legend gave it a face, and the face, it turned out, was exactly the right face for the feeling that had always been there. Section 11. The Haunted Cartridge Legends. Lost Silver, Strangled Red, and the stories the games told. Against themselves. There is a specific subgenre within the broader tradition of Pokémon creepypasta that deserves its own extended treatment. These are the haunted cartridge stories. The tales of corrupted saves, glitched games, and cartridges that seem to have developed something like malevolent awareness. Where the Lavender Town Syndrome and the Buried Alive legends were stories about things hidden inside the normal games, the haunted cartridge genre was built around the premise that certain individual copies of Pokémon games had been corrupted, possessed, or transformed into something different from what they should have been. And while these stories are no more factually grounded than the Buried Alive legend, they represent a more ambitious kind of horror fiction because they took the premise of the player's own save file, the record of their personal journey through the game, and made it the site of the horror. The most celebrated of these is Lost Silver, a creepypasta about a corrupted copy of Pokémon Gold. The story was written in 2010 and spread rapidly through the same channels as the Lavender Town creepypastas, finding an audience in the Pokémon fan community that was primed by that point to receive dark mythology about the second-generation games specifically. The story is told in first person by a player who discovers an old Game Boy Color cartridge of Pokémon Gold in a used game store and begins playing it, only to find that the save file on the cartridge is unlike any normal game state they have encountered. The player's character in the corrupted save file is named Silver. He is in a location that should not exist in the game, a dark, empty space that resembles none of the normal maps. He has no Pokémon in his party. His sprite, when checked, shows him missing his arms. The Pokédex is full. The completion is total. Every Pokémon caught, every move learned, every item obtained. But the character is alone and physically degraded, and as the player progresses through the corrupted file, the degradation deepens. The character's face disappears from the sprite. The character's legs disappear. The game's normal Pokémon, when they occasionally appear, seem to be behaving oddly, moving in patterns that suggest something other than their normal programmed behaviors. And throughout all of this, the game's dialogue boxes periodically display messages that feel like they are being addressed directly to the player behind the screen. Not to the in-game trainer, but to the person holding the Game Boy. The horror of Lost Silver is not in any single specific element, but in what the story accumulates across its length. It takes the things that are most personal about Pokémon, the trainer's name, the party of bonded companions, the save file that represents hours of a specific person's time and investment, and systematically strips them away. The trainer loses his arms, his face, his legs, his Pokémon, his humanity. The journey that the game is supposed to represent, the growth and accumulation of a trainer's story, is run in reverse, ending not at a championship, but at an empty shell in an empty space. The story's emotional logic is about the experience of finishing, of having done everything there is to do in a game you loved, and finding on the other side of completion not triumph, but absence. The Pokédex is full, the trainer is gone. The adventure consumed the adventurer. This resonated with a specific anxiety that the Pokémon community had been developing since the franchise's early years, which is the anxiety about what happens when you complete the Pokédex and there is nothing left to catch. The game's fundamental drive is the accumulation of new encounters, new creatures, new knowledge. The slogan, "Gotta catch 'em all," is a directive that the game eventually allows you to fulfill. And when it is fulfilled, when the last box is filled and the last Pokémon registered, the drive is gone. Lost Silver told a story about what that completion looks like from the inside. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the trainer, alone. In the dark, with no arms, having caught them all, and found that catching them all left nothing of himself. Strangled Red was another significant entry in the haunted cartridge genre. This one centered on a corrupted Pokémon Red save file that had been found on an old cartridge at a garage sale. The story differed from Lost Silver in its emphasis. Where Lost Silver was primarily about the corruption of the player's own identity and journey, Strangled Red was about the corruption of the game's relationship to the creatures within it. The narrator, playing through the mysterious cartridge, found that the game seemed to be aware of the Pokémon it contained in ways that the normal game is not, and that this awareness manifested as cruelty. In Strangled Red, the in-game trainer's Pokémon were subjected to treatment that violated the contract Pokémon normally operates under. Moves were used that should not have been possible in the context of normal battles. The game forced the player into situations where their Pokémon were harmed not by opponents they were battling, but by the game itself, by a hostile logic operating underneath the normal systems. Pokédex entries, normally a source of simple biological description, were replaced with text that described the Pokémon's suffering in the first person, as if the creatures themselves had found a way to address the player through the game's own interface. The entries described what it felt like to be trapped, what it felt like to be used as a tool, what it felt like to not be heard. The horror of Strangled Red was an accusation. It pointed at the basic premise of the franchise, the catching and training and battling of creatures who had no choice in the matter, and it asked whether that premise had ever been examined from the creature's perspective. The game's cheerful framing of Pokémon training as a positive relationship built on mutual respect and shared goals was stripped away, replaced with a vision of the same activities from the inside, from the perspective of something trapped in a ball and deployed in fights it did not choose. It was the darkest possible reading of the franchise's premise, And it worked as horror precisely because the franchise had always carefully avoided looking directly at that reading. The Hypno's Lullaby deserves mention here as a different kind of Pokemon horror, one that drew on the game's established lore about a specific Pokemon rather than on a corrupted save file narrative. Hypno is a psychic-type Pokemon whose design is based on the hypnosis imagery of a figure with a pendulum. Its Pokédex entries describing its ability to put humans to sleep with a swinging crystal pendant. One entry in the original games described how if Hypno is not careful with its hypnotic abilities, humans can be put to sleep for extended periods and have disturbing dreams. Another entry mentioned cases of children being put to sleep and not waking up, though the game framed this as a physiological effect of the hypnosis rather than an act of intent. The Hypno's Lullaby creepypasta took these elements and assembled them into a piece of in-universe media, a fictional children's song that Hypno was depicted as singing to lure children away from their homes. The lullaby itself was written in a register that deliberately evoked real nursery rhymes, while gradually introducing unsettling elements, references to following the sound into the dark, to not telling your mother where you're going, to the warm, safe darkness of somewhere far from home. The song was designed to work on multiple levels simultaneously, functioning as a genuine children's song at its surface while building to a horror logic underneath. And it worked with disturbing effectiveness because it drew on the real and documented Pokédex entries about Hypno's ability to put children to sleep, taking what the game had presented as a biological fact and extrapolating it into its worst possible narrative application. These haunted cartridge and dark lore stories collectively served a function in the Pokémon fan community that the official games were never going to serve. They explored the anxieties that the franchise's cheerful premise naturally generated but never addressed. What does it feel like to be a Pokémon? What does it mean to complete the Pokédex and have nothing left? What is the relationship between a trainer and the creatures they catch really like from the creature's perspective? What happens to the places and the stories and the characters that the games leave behind as you move forward? These are the questions that the creepypasta genre asked, and they are the right questions, even if the answers the creepypastas offered were horror rather than resolution. The genre also produced something unexpected, which was genuine craft. Some of the best written pieces in the Pokémon creepypasta tradition are genuinely effective short horror fiction, stories that would hold up outside the context of their source material. Lost Silver's systematic deconstruction of the trainer identity is structurally elegant. The way Strangled Red builds its accusation across the length of its narrator's playthrough is dramatically sophisticated. The Hypno's Lullaby uses the form of a children's song to do something that genuinely unsettling work. These are not just playground rumors attached to a franchise for shock value. They are creative works that use the franchise's specific emotional textures as raw material for something new. The franchise eventually began to process some of this darkness through official channels, though carefully and at a safe distance. The Pokédex entries for later generations became progressively more willing to lean into horror, with entries for creatures like Dryfloon describing it kidnapping children and entries for Yamask stating that the mask it carries is its own human face from before it died and became a Pokémon. The canon expanded to accommodate the kind of darkness that the creepypastas had been exploring, which was both a sign of the creepypasta's influence and a sign that the franchise recognized something true in the territory they had mapped. But the creepypastas were always going to be freer to follow their logic to its end than the official games could afford to be. The official games had to sell to children and satisfy parents and maintain a brand identity that had been carefully built over decades. The creepypastas had no such obligations. They could follow the question wherever it led. They could ask whether the trainer was the hero or the captor. They could let the Pokémon Tower's music do what it wanted to do rather than what it was allowed to do. They could give the darkness in Lavender Town a form that matched the feeling exactly, rather than stopping short of it at the point where the product's requirements overrode the story's demands. And so the legends persist. They persist because the questions they ask are real, and the feelings that prompted them are real, and no amount of official product has ever fully satisfied either the questions or the feelings. The grass is still tall. The tower is still 7 floors of gray stone in a gray-purple town. And somewhere in the data of those original cartridges, in the empty spaces between what was designed and what the hardware could actually hold, something is still waiting to be found. Section 12. The Pokémon that were never caught. Eternal Flower Florges, Azure Flute Arceus, and the tragedy of unreleased events. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs specifically to the Pokémon fan community, and it is the grief of the thing that was promised and never delivered. The thing that was announced, or that evidence strongly suggested was planned, or that an NPC in the game cryptically hinted at in language that could only mean one thing, and that then simply never arrived. Not canceled with an apology, not removed from the game code, just never distributed, never explained, never addressed. Left hanging in the space between what the game contained and what the player could actually access, a permanent presence as an absence. The most famous and most painful of these is the Eternal Flower Floette. In Pokémon X and Y, the game introduced a Pokémon called Floette, an evolution of Flabébé, a small fairy-type creature associated with flowers. But in the game's narrative, one specific Floette appeared that was unlike any other. It belonged to a character named Azai, an ancient king who had lived for over 3,000 years as the result of a machine he had built to resurrect his dead Floette after it died in a war. The machine had worked, resurrecting the Floette, but had done so at the cost of the lives of many other Pokémon. And the guilt of this act had haunted AZ and his Floette for 3 millennia. By the time the player encounters them at the game's conclusion, they have finally found peace with each other. The Floette that AZ carried was specifically referred to in the game as the Eternal Flower Floette, and it had a different form from any normally catchable Floette, featuring a flower with 5 petals of different colors rather than the standard single-color flower. It existed in the game's code as a complete accessible data entry with unique sprite data, unique cry data, and unique stats. It had an entry in the game's internal registry. It was, by every technical measure, a Pokémon that was ready to be distributed to players. An NPC in one of X and Y's towns specifically told players that they would be able to obtain the Eternal Flower Floette eventually through an event distribution. The NPC was not making a thematic observation about the story. They were making a statement about game mechanics, about a future event item that would allow players to obtain the form they had seen in the cutscene. The hint was direct enough that it was impossible to interpret as anything other than an announcement of an upcoming distribution. The distribution never came. The announcement the NPC promised was never made. The event that would have provided the Azure Flute equivalent for Floette was never scheduled or executed. As of this recording, players who want the Eternal Flower Floette can only obtain it through device manipulation, through the kind of workarounds that represent an unofficial engagement with the game's internal data rather than a legitimate play experience. The Pokémon that a character in the game explicitly told players they would receive one day remains locked in the biome, fully formed and fully ready, waiting for an event that will now never arrive. The Azure Flute situation discussed in the Arceus section is the most closely analogous precedent. The Azure Flute was the item that would have allowed players to legitimately access the Hall of Origin and encounter Arceus in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl. The hall was coded. The flute was coded. The encounter was designed with its own specific dialogue about creation and divinity that went beyond what any other Arceus encounter contained. And then the flute was never distributed. Arceus was eventually available to players through other means, but the Hall of Origin experience, with its specific framing and its specific dialogue about the nature of Arceus's role in the world, was never delivered through any legitimate channel during the original game's distribution window. Both of these situations reflect a pattern in Game Freak's relationship with event distributions that fans have found consistently frustrating, which is the pattern of designing content specifically intended to be delivered through special events, and then either not delivering it or delivering it in a reduced form that bypasses the designed experience. The original games contain numerous traces of this pattern: items with complete data and no legitimate acquisition method, Pokémon forms with sprites and stats, and move pools that can only be accessed through code manipulation, NPC dialogue referencing content that never materialized. The mystery within this pattern is the question of intention. When Game Freak designed the Hall of Origin with its specific Arceus dialogue, what did they intend to happen there? When they added the NPC in X and Y who told players to look forward to the eternal flower floette distribution, what had they planned for that event? Were these things that were genuinely planned and then canceled for logistical or creative reasons? Were they placeholder content that was never meant to be delivered, designed during development, as stand-in material that someone forgot to remove from the shipped game? Were some of them designed as genuine enhancements to the game's narrative and then withheld as a form of planned scarcity that was eventually abandoned? None of these questions has been officially answered. The Pokémon Company's event distribution history is largely undocumented from the development side. What happened internally when event decisions were made, when content was designed and then not distributed, when NPCs were written to reference distributions that never occurred, is not information that has been shared publicly. The result is a collection of ghost Pokémon, creatures and items that exist in the code and cannot legitimately be obtained, fossils of a more elaborate game that was designed and then partially buried. There is also the deeper question of what it means for the game's narrative when these gaps remain unfilled. The Eternal Flower. Floette's story in X and Y is one of the most emotionally resonant subplots in the franchise's history, a 3,000-year story about grief and guilt, and the specific kind of love that outlasts both. Aziz Floette is the center of that story. Giving players access to it was a way of letting them carry that story with them beyond the game's credits, a way of making the emotional weight of the narrative portable. Without the distribution, the story ends at the credits, and the Floette remains in Aziz's hands and in the game's code, accessible to the player's memory but not to their party. The story is complete, but the connection is severed. The game told you that you would eventually be able to carry this with you, and then it did not let you. These unfulfilled promises are their own kind of mystery, quieter than the Lavender Town legends and less dramatic than the buried alive creepypastas, but in some ways more genuinely haunting, because they involve real absences in real games that real players actually own. The data is there, the content exists, the item is in the code, the hall is in the code, the Pokémon is in the code. They are there and they are inaccessible, not because the technology is unavailable or the game is broken, but because a decision was made somewhere by someone not to open the door. And that decision, like so many of the decisions discussed in this video, was never explained to the people who were waiting on the other side of it. The Azure Flute is still in the code of Diamond and Pearl. The Hall of Origin is still in the code of Diamond and Pearl. The Eternal Flower Floette is still in the code of X and Y. They have been there for years and years, fully formed, waiting. Whatever they were supposed to unlock in the player's experience of those games, that unlocking never came through any legitimate means for most players. And the questions those absences generate, questions about what the designers intended, about what story those events were supposed to tell, about what the franchise meant to say with those pieces of content, and then chose not to say through the normal channels, are questions that belong to this video, to this tradition of sitting quietly with the things that Pokémon left unfinished and unreachable and unexplained. The ghost items and the ghost Pokémon and the ghost events are part of the franchise's mythology now, as real in their way as the Lavender Town music or the missing Raticate or the Cubone's mother's skull. They are the things that were almost given to us, the doors that were built and never opened, the game that was designed and only partially shipped. And in the gap between what was designed and what was delivered, in that permanent, unreachable space, the franchise's history of mystery finds one of its quietest and most honest expressions. Section 13, The Pokémon World's War. Lieutenant Surge, Missing Fathers, and the Dark History. No one talks about. There is a theory about the Pokémon world that does not involve glitches or creepypastas or leaked development data. It does not involve Lavender Town or missing party members or the shadow of a divine origin. It is built entirely from what the official games explicitly say and from what those explicit statements imply about the history of a world that is otherwise presented as relentlessly cheerful. There was a war in the Pokémon world. This is not a fan theory in the sense of something constructed from ambiguous evidence. It is a fact that the game acknowledges directly, in passing, in a single line of dialogue, spoken by a gym leader in Vermilion City. Lieutenant Surge, the electric-type gym leader whose gym stands on the docks of the city where the SS Anne is moored, tells the player when you defeat him, "I tell you, kid, electric Pokémon saved me during the war." Just one line. The game moves on immediately afterward, as if this is merely a piece of biographical detail about a gym leader, rather than a revelation about the world the player has been inhabiting. But that one line establishes something with complete clarity. There was a war. Lieutenant Surge fought in it. He survived because his electric Pokémon protected him. The war is part of living memory for at least one character in Kanto. The game never says anything else about this war. It does not name the conflict. It does not name the parties involved. It does not indicate when it began, how long it lasted, how it ended, what it was fought over, or how many people died in it. Lieutenant Surge is the only character in the original Red and Blue who mentions it at all, and even his mention is casual rather than reflective. A piece of personal history offered as context for his enthusiasm about electric-type Pokémon, rather than as an invitation to discuss the event itself. The war is the most significant political fact in the franchise's backstory, and it occupies exactly one sentence of game text. And then the franchise moved on from it and has never directly returned. That one sentence, however, generates extraordinary interpretive pressure when you hold it up against everything else the franchise shows us about its world. Because when you look at the demographics of the Pokémon world, you notice something remarkable. The cities and towns of Kanto, and the cities and towns of every region the games have depicted since, are populated in ways that do not match what a normally functioning society would produce. There are children everywhere, traveling alone, managing their own affairs, making decisions that would in any real-world context require adult guidance and oversight. There are elderly people. There are mothers raising their children. There are young adults of both genders, and there's a significant and conspicuous scarcity of adult men in the ordinary civilian population. The gym leaders are mostly there because their function requires them to be. The professors are there. The antagonists of the villain organizations are there, often skewing male in a way that separates them from the civilian population's demographics. But the ordinary adult men, the ones who should be running shops and farming and going about the kind of daily life that a functioning civilization requires its adult population to maintain, are largely absent. You do not walk through Pallet Town and see fathers taking their children to the park. You do not walk through Viridian City and see grown men going to work. You see an elderly woman who will give you a potion. You see kids playing. You see a Pokémon researcher heading somewhere important. The ordinary male civilian is, as a category, simply not present in numbers that would make sense for a normally populated world. The theory that connects these two observations is straightforward and brutal. The war that Lieutenant Surge fought in was recent enough to have profoundly altered the demographics of the region. The adult men who are absent from the towns and cities of Kanto are absent because many of them did not come back from that war. The mothers who are raising their children alone are alone because the people who should be with them are gone. The children who are setting out at age 10 on journeys that would be unusual or impossible in a normally structured society are setting out at 10 because the society is not normally structured, because the generation of adults who would normally be guiding and protecting them was thinned by a conflict that the franchise mentions once and then carefully does not discuss further. This theory connects directly to everything discussed in the section on Ash's father. Ash's father is absent because he went on a Pokémon journey and never came back. This is the canonical explanation given in interviews and in the anime's sparse references to the character. But the war theory suggests an alternative context for that absence. What if the journey that Ash's father is on is not a voluntary adventure, but a continuation of the service that Lieutenant Surge refers to? What if the trainers who are still out there, still traveling, still not coming home, are doing something that the world requires of them in the aftermath of a conflict that the franchise does not want to explicitly describe? The question of Ash's father's absence becomes, in this reading, not a personal story about one man's choices, but a symptom of something systemic, something that happened to an entire generation and left their families holding the space where they used to be. The war theory also recontextualizes the relationship between Pokémon and combat in ways that the franchise has always been careful not to examine directly. Pokémon are trained to fight. That is the central activity of the games. The battling system is the mechanical heart of the franchise. And the games present this as a sport, as a form of personal development, as a competition between consenting participants who engage voluntarily for the purpose of growth and self-improvement. But Lieutenant Surge's line suggests a different relationship between Pokémon and combat that precedes the sporting context. A relationship where the capacity of electric Pokémon to incapacitate opponents was used in a context of genuine violence and genuine consequence. The skills that the games teach trainers, the skills that gym badges certify, existed before the gym badge system. They existed in the context of a war. They were developed and practiced and passed down in conditions where losing a battle had consequences more serious than a trip to the nearest Pokémon Center. This does not mean that the games are secretly about child soldiers, or that the trainer system is covertly a military program, or any of the darker extrapolations that can be made from the evidence. The franchise is genuinely a story about friendship and adventure and the joy of building relationships with remarkable creatures. But it is a story that, if you look at it with attention to what it does not say, is also a story about a world recovering from something. A world that chose to build a culture around the same skills that were once used in conflict and redirect them toward competition and personal growth. A world that found a way to keep the knowledge without keeping the violence, or at least without keeping the official narrative of the violence. The war is the silence at the center of the Pokémon world's history. Everything radiates from it. The absent fathers, the children traveling alone, the gym badge system that certifies combat proficiency, the 10-year-old protagonist who sets out across a region full of potentially dangerous creatures without an adult companion and manages fine because, in this world, managing fine without an adult companion is not extraordinary. It is the expected condition of children who grew up in the aftermath of a generation that did not entirely come home. Lieutenant Surge survived. He built his gym on the Vermilion City docks, and he teaches trainers, and he knows his electric Pokémon, and he does not, apparently, talk about the war except in that one passing reference that every player has heard, and almost no one stopped to fully unpack. The world moved on. The children inherited it. The grass grew tall over whatever had been fought over and lost. And some of those children, grown up now, are still out there somewhere. On journeys that started years ago and have not ended, leaving hats behind, not coming home, becoming the next generation of the absence that the war started, and the franchise has been quietly sustaining for 30 years without naming what it is. The war in the Pokémon world is the one mystery in this video that requires no speculation about code or fan theory or creative reimagination of the evidence. It is stated. It happened. Everything else about it is silence. And that silence, maintained across 30 years and dozens of games and hundreds of hours of anime, is the most deliberate and the most complete silence in the entire franchise's history. Lieutenant Surge was the only one who spoke about it, and he only said one sentence. Then he gave you his badge and let you get back to your adventure, into a world where everyone else was also pretending that the silence was not there. Section 14, the ghost-type question. What are they really? No category of Pokémon has generated more unsettled dark lore than the ghost types. They have always occupied a special place in the franchise's atmospheric imagination, appearing first in the haunted tower of Lavender Town, present wherever the games decide to lean into something heavier than adventure. They are associated with death, with memory, with the persistence of something after the thing that held it together has dissolved. Their Pokédex entries are, generation after generation, among the darkest pieces of official text the franchise produces. But the question underneath the ghost-type entries, the question that the entries dance around without ever quite answering, is about what exactly these creatures are. Not biologically, metaphysically. The franchise has always hinted that ghost-type Pokémon may not be Pokémon in the way that other Pokémon are Pokémon, that they may be something else wearing the shape of a creature, or something that used to be something else entirely and has been transformed into what they are now. And the most disturbing version of that hint is the one that appears across multiple generations and multiple creatures. The suggestion that some ghost-type Pokémon were once human. The Pokédex entry for Yamask in Pokémon Black and White is the most explicit example. The entry states that each Yamask carries a mask that represents its face from when it was still human, that it sometimes looks at the mask and cries. This is not a metaphor. The game is stating plainly that Yamask was a person. It has a face. It remembers being the thing whose face it carries. It grieves the loss of what it was. The step from human to Pokémon is presented not as a biological event, but as a transformation that retains the awareness and memory of the original being, which means that Yamask is not just a Pokémon that looks like a ghost. It is a person who has become a ghost in the literal sense, a human consciousness persisting in a form that was not human. Phantom's entry in X and Y states that these Pokémon are the spirits of children who died in the woods and inhabited old tree stumps. Not evolved from anything, not spawned from an egg, born from death, born from the specific death of children. Every Phantom in every forest you have walked through in X and Y is a child who wandered away from somewhere and did not come back, who became the small, rounded stump creature that now rustles among the trees. The entry is so casual about this that it reads almost as a naturalist's note, a field observation about where you can find this species, as if the manner of their origin is simply a biological fact, rather than the most horrifying thing the franchise has ever quietly said. Dryfloon, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, is described in one of its entries as a Pokémon that carries away children who grab its string. Not accidentally, with intent, or at least with consistent behavior that produces that outcome repeatedly enough to be documented in the Pokédex as a characteristic. The entry does not say where the children go. It does not say what happens to them when they get there. The balloon Pokémon that floats at the Valley Windworks on Friday afternoons, waiting to be caught, is also the thing that takes children to wherever children go when they disappear and do not come back. The relationship between these creatures and the human dead is something the franchise has been circling for 30 years without committing to a definitive statement. Are ghost-type Pokémon always human in origin? The lore does not support this reading uniformly. Haunter and Ghastly and Gengar appear in the Pokémon Tower among the graves, but their Pokédex entries describe them as creatures that evolved from a gas cloud or as shadow Pokémon that detach from surfaces in darkness, not as transformed humans. The relationship between ghost types and human death seems to be more of a spectrum than a binary, with some ghost types clearly derived from human origin and others seemingly native to the world as natural creatures who happen to inhabit the same emotional register as death. But the Yamask case is specific enough that it will not stay in the category of atmospheric suggestion. A Yamask carries its own face. It remembers being human. It cries when it looks at the mask. These are not the behaviors of a creature that is metaphorically associated with death. They are the behaviors of a person who has lost everything except the memory of what they had. And the game distributes these creatures throughout its world as catchable Pokémon that the player can add to their party and use in battles without ever fully reckoning with what it means to do that with a creature that was once a person. The ghost-type lore is the franchise's most sustained engagement with the genuine strangeness of the world it has built. And it is an engagement that the franchise keeps making more complicated rather than resolving. Each generation adds new ghost-type entries that push the category further into territory that the game's cheerful framing cannot entirely contain. The accumulation of these entries over 30 years has produced an implicit argument, never made explicit, about what ghost types actually are. They are the evidence that death in the Pokémon world is not a wall, but a door. That the things that were alive leave traces. That the world is full of presences that are not alive in the normal sense, but are not absent either. They are what remains. They are the grief given form, the memory given motion, the human face carried forward into a shape that the living world can still interact with, even if it cannot fully understand what it is interacting with. The question of what ghost-type Pokémon are is one that will probably never be fully answered by the franchise, because answering it would require committing to a statement about what death means in this world that the franchise does not want to make. The games want their ghost types to be atmospheric and interesting and occasionally frightening. They do not want to fully commit to the metaphysics of what it would mean if some of their catchable Pokémon were once people. That commitment would make the game impossible to play in the same way, would make every Pokemon Tower an old chateau and ghost-type encounter, something that could not be navigated without ethical consideration that the game's design actively forecloses. So the entries keep hinting. Yamask remembers. Phantump is a child. Dryfloon carries children away. And the player catches them and names them and uses them in battles, and the franchise moves on, and the question of what they are stays open, sits in the tall grass rustling, waits for someone to look at the right angle at the right time and feel the particular chill that comes with knowing that the most interesting answer to the question is one that nobody is officially willing to give. Closing. The questions that stay. We have been in this world for a long time tonight. We walk slowly through it, the way you walk through places that matter to you. Not rushing, not skimming, paying attention to the corners, listening for what the music does when it thinks no one is checking. We walked through the music of a graveyard town and the legend that grew from it, a legend so powerful that debunking it 30 times has not diminished its hold on the people who grew up with that gray-purple palette and that circling, unresolved melody. We sat with the shape of emptiness in a cartridge's code and traced the name that emptiness earned. Missing number? The backwards L shape in the tall grass of a coast that was not supposed to generate encounters. The thing that should not have been there and that has been there ever since. We examined the evidence for a connection between a flat purple blob and the ancestral creature of all life. Two creatures that share a weight and a color and a move and a location and a silence from the company that created both of them. A silence that has now lasted 30 years and still has not broken. We followed Cubone's skull to its possible origin and found what might be one of the most profound and quietly devastating evolutionary designs that was almost built and then almost erased except for the traces it left in code, and leaked data and a sun and moon. SOS call that a game made. 20 years later still knows to send. We spent time with a father who does not have a name, who left only a hat, whose absence was structural and whose mystery was, perhaps, always the point. We stood in the Pokemon Tower and counted 5 Pokemon, where there should have been 6, and held the question of what that arithmetic means in the context of a graveyard and a battle on a ship. We asked what was before the egg in the void, and followed that question to the place where all creation myths eventually arrive, which is the acknowledgement that the beginning cannot account for itself in its own terms. We looked at flat, unremarkable letter-shaped creatures and found in them the possible medium of divine creation, the alphabet of a universe used by its own God to speak the world into being. We walked through a leaked prototype and met the Pokémon that almost existed, the two-headed giraffe whose palindromic name finally made sense, the electric tiger cub, the Marowak carrying a child that was perhaps the confirmation of a theory that had been developing since 1996. We sat with the haunted cartridge legends, Lost Silver and Strangled Red and the Hypno's Lullaby, and followed the logic of what it means to build horror from the most personal thing the games contain, which is the save file, the record of a specific person's journey. We sat with the unreleased events, the azure flute that was never handed out, the eternal flower flet that a character in the game promised was coming and never arrived, the ghosts of content that was designed and withheld. And we ended with a single line from a gym leader in Vermilion City, and the enormous silence that line creates around itself. The silence of a war that happened and changed the world, and was never named or described or explained, only mentioned in passing by a man who survived it with his electric Pokémon and built a gym and mostly does not talk about it. What draws us back to these open questions, to these late nights with the volume up and the lights down, sitting with the things that the franchise generated and never resolved? What is it about the permanently unanswered that makes it so right for this particular kind of listening? I think there are at least 2 answers. The first is specific to this franchise. The Pokémon games were designed around the pleasure of incompleteness, the drive generated by the feeling that there was always more. The next patch of grass, the next route, the next Pokémon not yet caught, the map with edges you had not reached. The forward motion of the games was always powered by the gap between what you had and what remained. And for the people who have been playing since the beginning, that official incompleteness is largely resolved. The Pokédex can be finished. The game can be completed. The map can be charted from border to border, The forward motion that sustained the adventure stops at the credits. The mysteries are what fill that space. They are the grass that never gets completely walked through, the questions that never arrive at a catch screen, the things that keep rustling at the edges of a world that was supposed to have been fully explored. In a franchise built on the transformation of unknowns into knowns, the permanently unknown has a particular and irreplaceable value. The second answer is more general and more human. We need mystery the way we need certain other things that are difficult to justify but impossible to give up. We need the sense that the world is larger than our current understanding of it, that the explanation does not exhaust the experience, that what something feels like is not completely captured by what it is. The franchise gave millions of people a world that felt, in their childhood, genuinely large and genuinely strange. The strangeness was real. The feelings the games produced in Lavender Town and on the east coast of Cinnabar Island and in the empty slot of a rival's party were real feelings responding to real atmospheric choices made by real designers who were trying to make something that breathed. The mysteries are the way that realness persists. They are the way the world stays alive long after you have finished the game and put the cartridge down. They are the reason that 30 years later, in the quiet hours, it is still possible to think about a small purple blob in the tall grass and feel something that requires explanation. And the explanation, as always, is incomplete. The explanation is never quite finished. The question opens onto another question. Ditto is maybe a clone. The clone raises the question of what a failed clone means about the original. The original raises the question of what was before the original. The before raises the question of what was before the beginning. And the before the beginning, as Arceus told us in its own language, has no equivalent in human speech, which is why the question stays open, which is why we keep coming back to it in the dark. The franchise understood this, I think, even when it did not fully intend it. The people who made Pokémon Red and Green in 1996 were making a game about catching creatures, and in the process of making it well, they made a world that was too alive to stay in its cartridge. It leaked out into the imaginations of everyone who played it and found there a kind of permanence that no official product can fully account for. The mysteries are that leakage taking permanent form, the questions that the official product could not contain, that came out through the seams of the design and took root in the dark and grew into something that the designers could neither claim nor entirely disclaim. So here is what stays. The Lavender Town melody, still circling, still not resolving. Missing number, still waiting at the coast. Ditto's secret, still unspoken by the company that holds it. Kubone's skull and its impossible fit. The father's hat. The missing Pokémon in the graveyard. The egg in the void before time existed. The unknown with their hidden power, pressed against the walls of the ruins. The demo Pokémon floating in their prototype forms. The buried alive, still asking in the dark if you know what lonely feels like. The unreleased events, the doors that were built and never opened. The war that was fought and never named. The silence around a single line of dialogue from a gym leader who made it home when others didn't. These are the questions that stay. The world that is bigger on the inside than any map has managed to contain. The grass that always has something in it you have not found yet, because some things were designed to be unfindable, and some things became unfindable by accident. And the difference between those two categories has never been entirely clear and perhaps is not meant to be. Sleep well. Let the world get quiet around you. Let the old familiar things settle in where they always settle, which is somewhere near the back of the mind where the important things live. The Pokémon world was always somewhere you could return to. It is still there. The mysteries are what make it returnable. They are what ensure there is always something left to think about in the small hours when the day has finished, and the quiet has finally arrived, and the grass is rustling, just outside the edges of what can be fully seen or named or explained. Good night. Stay curious. Keep your eyes on the grass. Thank you for spending these hours with us. These stories are made for exactly this kind of listening. The late hours and the quiet rooms, and the particular stillness that comes when everything else has finally gone dark. The fact that you are still here, that you stayed with us all the way through, means we made this for the right person. If you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss when we post another one of these long dives into the worlds that got under your skin and never quite left. We put real time and real research into every one of these, and knowing they reach people who appreciate that kind of care is what makes it worth doing. Drop a comment below. Tell us your favorite Pokémon mystery. Tell us the theory that got under your skin the most. Tell us the section of this video that made you see something you had never noticed before. Tell us what time it is and where in the world you are sitting right now. We read every comment, and the best ones inform how we plan the next video. If there is a specific unsolved question you want us to spend 2 hours on, tell us. The Pokémon world has 30 years of unanswered questions. We have barely started. Good night. The grass is always a little taller than it looks.